another link this morning. Sounds like she's having trouble. We're all picking up new IT skills during this time.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Johnson. How are you?
Delegate Tyler, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Doing well.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Today is a beautiful day.
Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Good to see you again.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Hey, Fran, how are you?
Good morning, Madam Chair. How are you doing?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Good to see you this morning.
You too as well. I love everything behind you on your shelves back there.
Oh, well, thank you.
Hey, Roz, what year composite is that?
Let me see. That was when Governor King, 2006.
So that was yours in my freshman year?
That's right.
There we go.
Delegate Boulevard, did you have that beard when you were a freshman?
Did not. I didn't have to shave when I was a freshman. It was that long ago.
And good morning once again to everybody. I just want to, we'll be getting started in just a minute or two, just making sure everybody can get signed on here first.
Good morning.
Good morning,
There
Senator.
she is.
Good morning.
Good. Well, I think we have a quorum, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome back. I want to thank everyone for their engagement yesterday. We are looking forward to continuing those rich discussions today. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Laura Fornash, and I'm a board member at the
Can't
Hunt
hear anybody. Whoa, whoa. I
Senator
can't
Lucas.
hear anybody.
Huh. How about other folks? Do we have sound? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs up, some sound?
Thumbs
Okay.
up. Thumbs up.
All right. Senator Lucas, getting any better?
That sounds like AOL over there.
Senator Lucas, are you good? No,
Yes, I'm here.
still no sound.
Laura, I'll try to call her and see if I can help problems
Okay.
there, and maybe we could go.
Okay.
Once we can go to Delegate Tyler and we can come around.
Sounds good. Okay. Well, again, for those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Laura Fornash, and I'm a board member at the Hunt Institute. I'm also a senior vice president at McGuire Woods Consulting and served as Secretary of Education under Governor Bob McDonnell. I first want to thank Senator Lucas and Delegate Tyler for their invaluable partnership and leadership in making the summit possible. I'm so very appreciative of the opportunity the Hunt Institute has to be a resource in Virginia, in addition to the other states that they help advise on education issues. Today's discussions will be largely focused on higher education as we open this morning's discussion with 3 higher education leaders on how they are guiding their colleges and universities through the pandemic. We will also have discussions on financing higher education and on post-secondary transition. Following our 3 higher education discussions, we will close with a discussion on broadband and distance learning. We know that you're hearing a lot of great information over these 2 days, and the Hunt Institute will be compiling a key takeaways document that they will email to you next week. It will include some of the key lessons we hear, links to additional resources, and contact information for the research experts that you've heard from these past 2 days. And now I would like to turn it over to Delegate Tyler to get us started with this morning's opening remarks. Delegate Tyler?
Good morning to everyone, and thank you, Laura. Today's discussion is going to be on higher education, focused as we discuss how I best serve higher education students in a disruptive moment. In our first session, we will be hearing from 3 higher education leaderships who will be discussing how they are navigating their colleges and their universities through this pandemic. I am excited to hear from national and state experts on these urgent topics. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Laura to transition us into the first discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Delegate Tyler. The first session this morning, titled An Armchair Discussion with Higher Education Leaders, will focus on college and university response to COVID-19. Opening this discussion will be Delegate David Bulova, who represents the 37th District in the Virginia House of Delegates. I've been fortunate to work with him on education policy ranging from preschool to higher education. Delegate Bulova, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura, and good morning to everybody. Great to see everybody's bright, shiny faces, and welcome to day 2 of the Virginia Education Summit. As Laura mentioned, I represent the 37th District in the House of Delegates. In case you haven't memorized your delegate districts, that's the city of Fairfax, as well as parts of Fairfax County. One of my favorite things about serving in the General Assembly is working with my chair, Roz Tyler, on the Education Committee and working on education policy. And of course, as we talked yesterday, COVID-19 has pretty much disrupted every aspect of education in Virginia. And so yesterday we had a chance to talk about those disruptions as they've manifested themselves in early childhood education as well as K through 12. And so today we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk about the impacts and responses for our system of higher education in Virginia. As with early childhood and also K through 12, the pandemic has really forced our leaders to make some pretty exceptional decisions in a very short period of time, not only in terms of pivoting and making sure that our students can still learn, but also ensuring that our students as well as our faculty and staff remain safe. I'm extremely grateful for the hard work of our college and university presidents and their leadership who have very tirelessly worked through the details of this pandemic. I want to give a special shout out to President Washington, and by that I mean Greg Washington, the president of George Mason University, which is in my district, and he actually reached out to me several times over the summer to talk about the challenges that they were facing, but particularly the solutions that they were trying to implement. And so it really helped me better understand not only what they were facing, but also how the General Assembly could be helpful in coming up with solutions. And so the General Assembly, we have made funding for higher education a priority, and that is reflected in the budget that, as my colleagues here know, we adopted and sent off for final passage to the governor yesterday. And while we weren't able to re-allot all of the money that was unallotted back in April, we did make some pretty sound investments, both strategic investments from our general fund, but also leveraging the CARES Act money to the tune of about $180 million that will go to the Commonwealth's institutions of higher learning to help navigate the pandemic. I also think it's worth mentioning that in addition to the immediate health and budgetary impacts that our colleges and universities are dealing with, one thing that COVID has also done is it has really accelerated workforce automation, and it has also just dramatically changed the way that we are using and view technology. And that's something that's going to change the way that we teach and the way that we engage in workforce development, not for the short term, but these are permanent changes that we're looking at. And so I just want to thank the Hunt Institute and everybody else for putting together what I think is going to be a great panel to help us navigate these issues. So moderating the discussion will be Frances Bradford, who is the Deputy Secretary of Education in the Commonwealth. And she has spent, and I know this for a fact, literally decades championing higher education in Virginia. And she's worked in several capacities, the most important of which was her role at the College of William & Mary, so go Tribe. But she was also on the State Council of Higher Education. And then, of course, she's got her current role as the Deputy Secretary, where I've had the privilege of working with her. And so I look forward to the discussion. And Fran, I will turn it over to you and your capable hands.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning to everybody. And thank you to the Hunt Institute for pulling this important conversation together this morning and for your great work in Virginia. And to Delegate Bulova for getting us started this morning. I've had the pleasure of working with him, as he noted, for many years. He takes seriously his responsibility as a legislator and takes the time to learn and ask the hard questions. I know this because he's asked me a lot of hard questions that I've not been able to answer. But the education community is really lucky to have him. Also, a huge thanks to the General Assembly members, especially our Education Committee chairs, Delegate Tyler and Senator Lucas, and all those also participating this morning. Your interest and engagement shows your commitment to Virginia's system of education from pre-K through our colleges and universities and all those involved, especially in these unusual and difficult times. As Dr. Herron from Williamsburg, James City County Public Schools noted yesterday, this has been a really challenging time for education in Virginia, across the country, and really all around the world. But I would start with complimenting our public and private colleges and universities, as Delegate Bulova did, as well as our higher ed centers across the Commonwealth. Last spring, we asked all of them to completely alter the way they did business and to do so basically overnight. And with very few exceptions, this went as well as could have been hoped. Their first priority was to keep their campus community safe, while at the same time continuing as best as possible their courses and programs online. For sure, there were some hiccups, as anyone who's wrestled with new technology can relate to, and some real inequities were exposed during all of this in terms of access to broadband and technology, and even in food and housing insecurities. But it is not hard to be proud of our higher education institutions, students, faculty, and staff, as they found ways to get students connected, faculty online, and additional aid to those who needed it. All of this comes at a cost, which I am sure we will be discussing together for many years to come. Some of them have the governor and you all have begun to address, and it certainly has raised some important questions about equity, program delivery, really what higher education could and should like in the future. We will have to look back on all of this in order to better prepare for our future and ensure Virginia continues to have the nation's best higher ed system. Getting this right is hard but necessary. As the 2020 Summit agenda reminds us, focusing on the education continuum from early childhood to post-secondary education and the workforce is critical to ensuring Virginia reaches its goal of being the best educated state in the nation, as well as maintaining Virginia's rightful place as a best state for business. These two things are intricately connected, something that has been starkly highlighted as a result of these past several months. Now, more importantly, let's hear from our great panel about their on-the-ground experiences during all of this. Since we all have access to the bios provided by our friends at Hunt, rather than read those, I thought I'd pick a few highlights and a favorite headline if I search their names on Google. Panelists, don't sweat. Dr. Quentin Johnson became president of Southside Virginia Community College in July 2019. Before arriving in Virginia, he worked in higher education, senior leadership roles for more than 20 years at institutions across the country. In my role, I've had occasion to visit many institutions. President Johnson was among the most energetic of campus leaders that I have encountered. His energy and enthusiasm are infectious, and his commitment to offering the educational opportunities that his community and business need is notable. And the best thing to pop up on Google was a headline that reads, "Lean Mean Johnson leaves us in tears." Now, in fairness, that turned out to be about Boris Johnson across the pond, but somehow it seemed to fit since his infectious sense of humor can really bring you to tears. Dr. Irma Becerra took office as the 7th president of Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia on July 1, 2018. President Becerra, who is a passionate advocate for all students, regardless of where they came from, has lived by her grandmother's words. Remember, whatever happens, no one can ever take away your education. I know firsthand how proud she is of her institution's recent and exciting designation as the only Hispanic serving institution in Virginia, something we should all cheer. And the best thing to pop up on Google, an article titled "Women Who Mean Business." And if you spent any time with her, you know this is true. President John Alger has served as the 6th president of James Madison University since July 1, 2012. An often overlooked fact is that he has a law degree, from Harvard no less, which becomes more apparent when you learn that he previously served as the senior vice president and general counsel at Rutgers and assistant general counsel at the University of Michigan. I know firsthand his strong commitment to civic engagement, having watched him lead Virginia's effort to become fully engaged in Campus Compact, an organization dedicated to fostering civic-based engagement, which is why I was not surprised that when my Google search turned up the headline, Harrisonburg and JMU staff to team up to turn a gymnasium space into homeless shelter. Of course, that wasn't as much fun as the other headline that said, JMU game day will put a little bang in your yin yang, but I couldn't figure out how to make that fit into my remarks. So with that, I will turn this over to our great panel. Presidents Johnson, Becerra, and Alger will each give us a few minutes on some of the greatest challenges facing our institutions right now. What approaches have each of you taken to address these challenges, and have those approaches been successful? President Johnson, will you get us started?
Yes, good morning, everyone, and happy Tuesday. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Fran Bradford, for your support and your leadership. I appreciate the introduction. I would like to acknowledge and thank our legislators, our senators, and our delegates for your commitment to higher education and to having this important conversation with the support of the Hunt Institute. Laura Fornash, to my colleagues, Jonathan Alger and Dr. Becerra, thank you for also being here. And I want to thank Delegate Tyler and Delegate Bulova. Let me tell you a little bit about my service area. Southside Virginia Community College is in what we call the Horseshoe, very poor, low income, challenged service area. My college's service area covers 10 counties. So from Fairfax County, over we hit South Boston, we serve students there in the Southern Virginia Higher Education Center. Greensville County, the city of Emporia, Farmville, Blackstone, Chase City, Keysville, Alberta. We are 4,200 square miles, and in very, very rural Southside Virginia. We have when the pandemic hit, and I think it's important to share that we, prior to the pandemic, were having challenges with our students across a vast rural service area, not having broadband. And so not having broadband and not having transportation infrastructure brought a particularly challenging set of challenges and opportunities to us. We also, because of 90% of our students are on financial aid, the vast majority of those are Pell eligible. And to give you a point of reference, I'm the eldest of 10 kids. My dad worked in a factory. I became a chief student affairs officer in 1980 in the Midwest. Chrysler bought out my dad's factory. And when Chrysler bought out American Motors, my dad worked at on an assembly plant for American Motors, Ramblers, and closed his plant, sent him to Ivy Tech, where I was a chief student affairs officer. And to see my dad walk through the door because his plant closed. I had 4 other siblings in college at that time having to pay, and my dad was still paying a house note and a mortgage, and mom was a stay-at-home mom. So the devastation of this pandemic on a service area that is already poor, and we have a large population of what Chancellor Dubois talks about in terms of the ALICE population, asset limited, income constrained, employed. The pandemic hit people who were working 2-3 jobs and couldn't make ends meet, and so now these people are. The pandemic has exacerbated this issue. So mobilizing we set up a COVID-19 team at our college and began to identify very quickly in March that we had to figure out how to get to a population of students who didn't have internet and broadband, who were not eating and could not pay rent. How do we get them their coursework, and how do we engage them? How do we keep them at the college, involved with the college? So I'm going to be brief, but I want to share a few pieces of what we did here at Southside Virginia Community College, and have an awesome faculty and administrative team who came together to help serve our students and the populations out there. And I also have to remind you that an important part of our mission is workforce development, short-term training. And so all those programs, our truck driving, our power line program, all those programs had to stop. Our governor schools were not engaged. And so just various pieces of the puzzle. We identified students who did not have access to broadband or internet and have technology. And we did that in part by asking faculty to correspond and work with students who didn't have access. And we did that by identifying students who were inactive in courses and who self-identified as not having technology. Our faculty worked to develop individualized plans with our students. Faculty worked directly with identified students to develop individualized education plans for completion. And this was complicated because we had to mail information and coursework to a vast number of students, did not have budgets to do that. But we did it because it was an important piece of the work. And so this broadband issue and internet, lack of internet, really particularly hit Southside Virginia and our vast service area very, very hard. And so our grading, we used incompletes, and we adopted no pass grading system to minimize the effect of the disruption on students' GPAs. Computer access, this is an important piece. We identified a list of places, probably about 80 businesses and localities within across our service area that had free or open Wi-Fi, and that included parking lots. And so we expanded Wi-Fi in our parking lots on our main campus in Alberta and in Keysville. We expanded online IT help desk services for our students, faculty, and staff. We explored roadblocks of using certain devices to access our internal Canvas and develop guidance for students. We explored the use of minimum technology standards for admission to our college. So we just to close, we also stocked more technology and computers in our bookstores so that financial aid could be used to purchase, used by students to purchase them. And we will continue to ask that you advocate and lobby for support for broadband services in our rural area. If we can't get word, if we can't communicate with our students, and they can't do their work, they don't have the technology or the ability to do that, we can't get opportunities to them so we can get them into short-term training programs, we can get them into college transfer programs and deliver our mission. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. I got to tell you that we were able to get through this spring semester, and we're right even. We're even in enrollment compared to a year ago, which is amazing. So our faculty and staff dug in really, really hard. We used technology to communicate with students. We sent them letters. We've been calling them, but our students, our retention is up. Our enrollment is we're less than 1% down. So we anticipated we would be 10 to 12, maybe 15% down in enrollment. So I just need to let you know that we need the resources to continue to communicate with our students, to get them the technology they need, and to make sure that we can continue to deliver our mission. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity. I appreciate you giving me a few minutes to share these thoughts with you.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Becerra?
Yes. Thank you, Laura and Secretary Bradford. Good morning to all our delegates and colleagues. First and foremost, I am delighted to hear that Governor Northam announced yesterday that the Commonwealth will include private institutions in receipt of CARES Act funds to help them address COVID-related expenses. We look forward to continue to support the Commonwealth goal of increasing the talent pipeline and educating our students by helping produce Virginia's future workforce. Also, thank you to our governor for supporting the eligibility for TAG for our Dreamer students. And on behalf of all the private university presidents in the Commonwealth, we thank you. When we started our COVID-19 task force at Marymount in January, it really felt like an academic exercise at first, much like we prepare for hurricanes or snow events, as none of us could have predicted the widespread and prolonged impact of this pandemic. In March, we pivoted to remote education and transitioned more than 700 courses to a virtual format. We are proud that our students continued learning, and more than 1,000 students will then graduate through a virtual commencement ceremony in May. But when we surveyed students late in spring and asked them, how did we do? They told us they preferred in-person learning as the ideal mode of course delivery. And that guided our decision to find a safe way to return to campus for the fall. I call this my aha moment when our students made it clear that they missed in-person instruction. A physical academic environment provides benefits that cannot be easily replicated online. Students are more likely to absorb what the professor is saying. They can more easily participate in collaborative exercises. They benefit from on-campus activities, and they gain meaningful exposure to other students with different backgrounds from all over the world. And we know that these experiences help students discover what their passion in life is. And that is what higher education is all about. For this reason, we started repopulating campus as soon as we received approval from CHEV on June 22nd with staff members, and then students returned back in late August. Our approach focused on rapid testing of anyone with symptoms or who had known contacts with anyone that had tested positive, as well as heavy emphasis on contact tracing. At this point, I feel comfortable in calling the fall semester a great success when we consider what we were up against. Only about 1% of our entire community has tested positive since the weeks before the semester started, and there have been no major outbreaks or hospitalizations. Our students will only be on campus for a few more weeks until Thanksgiving break, and they will complete the remainder of the semester in a virtual format. The greatest challenge we have faced is having to figure out a path forward without any clear federal direction. We had to create our own playbook. Other than the CDC guidelines, which we followed from the start, there was no coordination at the federal level. And as you all agree probably with me, COVID-19 should not have become so politicized. On the other hand, the State Council for Higher Education in Virginia, the Virginia Department of Health, and the Arlington County Public Health Department have been extraordinarily helpful in their support. We utilize VDH COVID-Wise app, which community members use to complete daily health screenings. Both the county and state health agencies have been great partners as we work to mitigate the spread of the virus whenever positive cases were identified on our campus. And their resources were very helpful when we thought to provide targeted testing for asymptomatic individuals. I am encouraged by the willingness of Virginia higher education institutions to adapt to COVID-19 and continue meeting workforce needs in the Commonwealth. I remember in the spring, many Marymount nursing graduates went straight from virtual commencement to working at ICUs and helping COVID-19 patients. This pandemic has shined a light on our areas of biggest need: healthcare, cybersecurity, business, and others. And we're working harder than ever to fill that need. For example, Marymount is working to support Virginia's efforts to prepare more cyber and tech workers for their careers, and we are an active member of CCI working with Innova Node. We are continuing to work closely with the Northern Virginia Community College to help more students transition their studies to Marymount. Marymount is also partnering with public institutions on Go Virginia projects, and we're eager to partner with them in key areas such as engineering, healthcare, and criminal justice. And finally, I'm happy to share with you, like Secretary Bradford mentioned, that this year, Marymount, for the first time in its history, became a Hispanic serving institution with 25.1% of its students Hispanic, and the only one in Virginia. So it's nice to see you all this morning, and thank you for inviting me to be here today.
Thank you, Madam President. And that really is exciting news for Virginia. So I appreciate you sharing that. President Alger?
Thank you, Fran, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you here from Harrisonburg. I too want to start with a word of thanks to the General Assembly for your support for higher education, especially in the special session with the CARES Act and COVID relief funds, as well as the general fund support. This was really critically needed at this time for Virginia higher education as we face these unprecedented challenges. So on behalf of all of us, I too want to thank all of you for your commitment to higher ed. So first, I'll list the major challenges we face, which are like what you've heard from my colleagues, and then how we've been approaching and dealing with those challenges. So, of course, first and foremost has been protecting public health and safety, and that means staying flexible and being prepared for sudden changes due to the nature of the pandemic. And we've worked very closely with the city and the county, the community around us every step of the way through the pandemic. Second, you've already heard about enrollment and academic challenges. So how do you keep students enrolled and on track with academic progress during this pandemic? Because of course we know that we're producing that educated workforce that we need for recovery and resilience for the Commonwealth. In our case, the fall enrollment was 1.3% below the original projection before the pandemic hit. Almost all of that due to out-of-state students. And of course, you can understand that's a trend around the country that you're going to have a hard time attracting and keeping out-of-state students, especially when so much is in this virtual context. And that, of course, has significant budget implications for institutions. You've already heard about the digital divide, and that is certainly something that we have seen as well in our student body that we had to deal with. The next challenge, of course, the financial and budgetary challenges have been enormous. You've had very significant increases in expenses with technology, testing, quarantine and isolation space, increased staffing for the University Health Center. And of course, the revenues are way down, right? You had significant refunds that were offered for tuition, room and board, bookstore revenues being way down. So many sources of revenues were down. And this is at a time when, at least for us, over the last 2 years, tuition has been frozen, as it has been at many of our public institutions. So financially, some real challenges here. And I would add to that the need for financial aid that has gone way up during the pandemic due to changing family economic circumstances. And the fourth big challenge that I would identify is community needs. At a place like JMU, we are anchor institutions for our communities in many parts of the Commonwealth. For example, in the Northern Shenandoah Valley, JMU is the largest employer and the largest economic engine, and many local businesses depend on our students as well as faculty and staff for their livelihood. So that's an important consideration as well when you think about our impact in the Commonwealth. So how do we deal with these challenges? Well, first, like our colleagues, adaptability, right? We spent many months making contingency plans before the academic year started, and we knew going into this year that we would have to be nimble and flexible to change course and to react to circumstances as needed. We invested heavily in technology to support online learning. We invested heavily in faculty workshops. Hundreds of faculty participated to learn how to use these tools. We had cleaning and safety protocols and equipment. So a lot that we did to prepare the campus. I will say that testing has been one of the big challenges in Virginia, and it varies by region. So in our case, equipment was diverted to nursing homes and other facilities right before the start of the academic year. That created some challenges, and tests were not readily available in our region at the beginning of the academic year to the same extent as they were in other parts of the country and other parts of the Commonwealth. Every campus and community, of course, is unique here, and waves of the virus have hit campuses at different times. So at JMU, we got hit early. We had a spike in our off-campus population shortly after the students came back, and guided by medical and public health experts and working with them every step of the way, we took some decisive steps to stop the spread. We pivoted to online learning for several weeks. We de-densified the campus temporarily, so about 15% of our students did leave campus on a temporary basis, again, on the advice and following protocols from the medical and public health experts. But the good news is we took these difficult steps and they were successful. The numbers are way down. We have 24 active cases and a university population of faculty, staff, and students that numbers well over 26,000 people. And there's no evidence, by the way, that cases are spreading from students to faculty and staff on campus or in classroom situations. So a lot to feel good about there. Of course, we always knock on wood because we know the pandemic is continuing. We also have greatly expanded quarantine and isolation space as well as testing. Thank goodness, additional testing has become available. We're now doing surveillance testing in addition to testing individuals who need it. These steps are, of course, expensive, but they are ongoing, and we're grateful that additional resources have become available. On the enrollment and academic front, of course, we've had a mix of in-person, hybrid, and online courses. Like Dr. Becerra indicated, our students do prefer to be in person when possible, but the students have been flexible, and I've really been impressed with their resilience as well as the faculty. We've been staying in touch with students who deferred or withdrew because they didn't want to have this unusual experience this year. And the hope is that many of them will come back either in the spring or in the fall. I especially want to acknowledge the General Assembly's support for targeted innovations like the Online Virginia Network, which is extremely helpful. Those of you that know OVN, that's a fairly new initiative where several institutions are working together to make online education available across Virginia. We've kept our campus facilities totally available, especially for students that need Wi-Fi and libraries and other resources. And we've been extremely generous with refunds for tuition, room, and board. On the budget front and financial front, to help us through the crisis, of course, we've taken very stringent cost-cutting measures. We've had an extended hiring freeze, for example. The state support, the CARES Act funds have been absolutely crucial, and we are very, very grateful for what you have done on that front. With financial aid, we pivoted all of our fundraising efforts late this spring for emergency financial aid for students and families because so many families' circumstances had changed. We raised over $750,000 in a short period of time, which kept over 130 students in school who might not otherwise have been able to stay in college. And then finally, on community support, knowing our role to support the rest of the community, we've used our faculty, staff, and student expertise to provide support and services to many local businesses and organizations. For example, developing protocols to help small businesses and entrepreneurs reopen safely, manufacturing and sharing PPE locally with healthcare providers, providing virtual services like literacy support for local children, and telehealth services through the College of Health and Behavioral Studies for people who couldn't visit doctors during this time. And finally, we formed a new Economic Development Council that is going to coordinate support for our community as it recovers. So we have big challenges that continue, but this is something that we've learned a lot. We are working together, and we really appreciate all that you continue to do.
President Alger, thank you for those remarks, and thanks to all three of you. It is clear that this has not been an easy several months, but you all and all of your campuses have worked hard to address the challenges. Would like to take advantage of the time that we have to ask these three some questions, some easy ones, but ask them some hard ones too. I know that they're up for the challenge, and just feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and I'll do my best to find you. While we are waiting for questions to come into the chat, maybe I'll turn to President Johnson with the first question just in my mind, and that's as we are chatting with the legislators, how should the legislature, President Johnson, be thinking about higher ed in the coming session, and what topics and issues should they prioritize? And you touched on a few of these, but if you just sort of reiterate those and offer any others that you might have.
Yes, thank you. And I wanted to acknowledge to Jonathan, my grandson is at your university, and you're doing a great job communicating with him and taking care of him. Thank you. Thank you. Broadband across rural Virginia is, I think, broadband needing to be a utility as opposed to an option here and there. We have to, if we can find a way through your support to advance that, to continue to advance that conversation. And I know you're going to be talking about it more and through this session. for my 10 county service area in the city of Emporia, we need you. G3, we have with our Alice population, my institution is a minority serving institution. We have so many underemployed, unemployed Virginians throughout our service area that need short-term training. Like my dad, he needed to get back to work quickly. And so having G3 as a priority, and would like to thank Governor Northam for the REV, Reemploying Virginia training vouchers that we are now working really hard to operationalize. Those are critical to families that are poor. Financial aid in itself does not do it. We don't have student loans at our institution, and a lot of our low-income families just don't have the time to come and stay a year or two to get a degree. And so that G3 is the G3 initiative, and support for that is just critical to community colleges and to our workforce, supporting our workforce economy as we come out of deal with, and then at some point come out of the pandemic. Dual enrollment. We have lots of dual enrolled students, and the dual enrolled, how to have a funding support mechanism for dual enrolled students across the Commonwealth. We've had much success in getting our dual enrolled students, who many of whom transferred to James Madison University and to Dr. Becerra's college. We need that support. Those are some of the pieces of the puzzle that are critical. And then the last thing I'll suggest is I've just completed a conversation, very important conversation on revising the law enforcement curriculum across our 23 community colleges. And one of the recommendations that came out of that work was that there's a statute, Virginia statute, that funds educational opportunities, educational support for law enforcement officers and for correctional officers across the Commonwealth, but it's never been funded. And so getting our law enforcement and correctional institutions, our officers, into training programs that help them become better officers, to understand the diversity of our great state is just critical. Virginia has the 8th largest immigrant population in the country. So those are the items that I would share, Fran, that would be priorities.
Great. Thank you, Mr. President. I think we've had a question from Delegate Bulova. Delegate Bulova?
Yeah, thank you, Fran, and thank you for the panelists. That was a really good overview. And so I wanted to pivot because all three of you touched on some of the short-term needs, and I've been taking notes with respect to the financial aid and broadband and G3, and that's all very, very helpful since we'll be in session in less than 2 months. I guess my question is thinking a little bit longer term. And so at what point do you start engaging in changing or retooling your long-term strategic plans? And I guess kind of what fits in that are, what changes are likely to be permanent, which ones, whether you like it or not, and how do you figure that out programmatically and budget-wise? What things are you going to have to change in terms of just curricular areas that you're teaching, and the demand for certain programs. But I'm just curious, when do you start that strategic planning process, and how do you see that manifesting itself?
Delegate Bulova, that is a great question. And I think all three panelists can probably bring something to the table on that front. President Alger, I'll start with you, then come to Dr. Becerra, and then President Johnson, if that's okay. President Alger?
Thanks, Fran. Well, that is a great question. In fact, that work has already begun. In the spring, when we were looking at our strategic plan, which we update every year, we added a key priority on recovering and learning from the pandemic. And I actually, in addition to appointing a contingency planning task force to deal with the pandemic, I also simultaneously appointed a pandemic-related learning and innovation task force, precisely to this question, to figure out what can we learn, how can we innovate coming out of this crisis and going forward. And so they are looking very carefully at how we teach, what are the shifts and demands. One of the things I would mention, for example, that we're already having to think about is there may be something of a shift from a need for brick and mortar going forward and more to technology needs. It's really expensive to do high quality online education. A lot of people think you can do this on the cheap, but to do it well and to do it right actually does require significant technology resources, as well as, of course, training your faculty, looking at new types of interdisciplinary programs. We actually had a COVID course that was interdisciplinary and team taught that started over the summer and continues into the fall. You're certainly seeing an increased interest in an area, not surprisingly, like the healthcare disciplines. And I think going forward, that's something that the Commonwealth should be thinking about in investing in. There's going to be additional needs certainly on that front. And reaching non-traditional, if you will, populations. So, one of the things we've all learned about the technology as faculty have become more comfortable with it is how can you leverage that to reach people that can't always be on a college campus, to do it synchronously or asynchronously. That online Virginia network, I think, is going to be one key to that. That is also something that colleges can work together on, as we do through the 4VA program that some of you may be familiar with. So I think there's a lot of innovation that is going to come out of this. We are not just going to go back to the same old way of doing things. By the way, we're also doing this to reach alumni, to reach people in terms of fundraising. So you're seeing the use of technology in all sorts of ways. And I think that's going to continue and will be a very important part of our strategic plan going forward.
Great. Thank you. President Becerra?
So Delegate, in answer to your question, when do we start changing our strategic plan? Well, we started already, and we also are adding, we are actually going through a process of a curriculum redesign and including a postgraduate certificate in equitable justice for our police in Arlington, but also beyond. Also, we are looking at starting a program in engineering, and we certainly are aware that this will not be the last pandemic that we will be facing. So how do we as a nation, how do we prepare a nation to be more resilient to future pandemics? In addition to all the current financial challenges that President Alger identified quite well, we are also thinking about what are some of the ongoing possible financial impacts. For example, will students opt not to attend college because of their family situation, or are they going to have to be taking care of elderly family members or siblings so they cannot devote themselves to full-time learning? How will these financial issues affect students and schools that may lead to lower graduation rates? And therefore, if they graduate at lower levels, that would diminish the talent readiness, the pool available to qualify for the jobs that we need them to fill in. And one clear lesson that we have learned as a nation is how the ongoing pandemic has disproportionately affected socially disadvantaged groups according to race and ethnicity. So higher education must find new ways to increase access and personalization, while we allow members of underprivileged groups to earn degrees that will secure their future and their family's future from future potential pandemics and times of social upheaval. So we are actually rethinking all the areas that we're going to be teaching in the near term to our students to address the needs, and what are some of the wraparound services that our students will need to be successful in these post-pandemic days.
Great, thank you. Dr. Johnson, if you don't mind taking a quick crack at this one, and then we've got another one queued up just for you. So I'm going to come right back to you.
All right, thank you. The Virginia Community College system embarked on a strategic planning process a couple of months ago. I am on that strategic planning task force, and so that the strategic plan will be a 6-year plan, 2021, 2027, which includes it'll be a strategic plan that will have a diversity lens piece to it that is going to be a little bit different, but it really will look at our ALICE population and how we get people to work over the next 6 years. Our pandemic planning within the Virginia Community College system and at Southside Virginia Community College has really, we've been looking at how we're going to serve students into the future. We don't think that we'll ever go back to 100% students in seats in classes, expanded online technology, availability of programs, and offering those programs via technology across a vast service area will be an opportunity to really do things differently. As we come through the strategic planning process from the VCCS, we will, in our service area, be working with business and industry partners to expand career and technical educational opportunities. Go Virginia, Go Tech, the Southern Virginia Education Center in Greensville County and Emporia. We're doing HVAC and working with our K through 12 partners to expand opportunities, both K through 12. We're doing some things with adults with career and technical education programs, and the Southern Virginia Higher Education Center in South Boston. We're doing some things. So that's just a quick snapshot, and I wish I had a little bit more time, but thank you.
Great. Thank you. Senator Hashmi, do you want to ask your question? Oh,
Thank you, Fran. And I think President Johnson has already started to answer this, but I was just wondering what VCCS in particular is doing to expand these CTE options and opportunities to work with high schools as well, so that we can begin to really focus on workforce development and create opportunities for on-site job training and apprenticeship programs. I think we really need to focus on developing these opportunities, and this is a great time to do that. So I just wanted to see what the VCCS is explicitly doing in this area.
Well, the VCCS has committed resources to workforce development and training. If you've not heard about our Powerline training program which is at Blackstone, our Dominion Energy and our business and industry partners, our energy partners in the region, the VCCS supported the establishment of that program. And we have a waiting list for Powerline training. It's an 11-week program. Students come out earning $50,000 to $60,000, and with overtime can be in 6 figures after an 11-week experience. So those are the types of opportunities that within the VCCS, we are committed to workforce development. Our strategic planning process is committed to expanding those opportunities, and with the real focus on the ALICE population. People who are working but still can't afford to make ends meet. We've got to get opportunities to them in our career and technical education opportunities that from K through 12, and an important part of that conversation is having clear pathways. And so those pathways for K through 12 adult, so you can start with a certificate, but then move into come back and add credentials, come back and get a 1-year, get a diploma, then get a certificate, then come back, get an associate's degree. And so as you advance, you make more money. Now financial aid is a critical part of that. But the commitment through the VCCS is strong. It's across our 23 community colleges. And at Southside Virginia Community College, we have a very, very strong workforce development program. Our auto diesel, our technical programs, our health, our nursing programs, one of the top programs in the Commonwealth. And so as we look at those opportunities and expanding them, LPN, practical nursing, and I can go on and on, but we are very, very focused on workforce, career, and technical education, and appreciate your support and interest in that area. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. And Senator, thank you for that great question. We've got about 5 minutes and I've got two folks in the queue, Delegate Davis and then Delegate Keene.
Sure, thank you. And I appreciate everyone being on here. I want to go back for a second over when it was mentioned the cost of technology. And there's no doubt that the cost of technology is great to convert over something long-term that allows you to provide the same quality instruction remotely as you can in the classroom with the professor. My question is, we've talked about this for a couple of years, and I think many of us don't mind making the investment, but I'm wondering, what does that ultimately maybe do to the cost to the student? Does it start bringing down the cost as some would anticipate? I specifically look to the Western Governors University. I believe then Delegate Ben Klein, now Congressman Ben Klein, pointed out that they have degrees for $16,000. It's all online. If we make the investment, does that start bringing down or work to start bringing down the cost of a college degree?
Can I take a stab at that?
Please.
Fran? Yeah, I think I usually take the time, even though we've made significant investments to make every one of our classrooms enabled for high flex education, which is hybrid flexible, means that we can have the professor that is teaching the class face to face with students in the classroom, also through Zoom. The class is being also accessed by other students that are taking it from home. The thing is that remote education, which is what we did as we pivoted back in March, is still preserve the faculty to student ratio. At Marymount is 12 students to a faculty member, and the students like that closeness with their faculty member. This model of online presumes that you have one professor to hundreds or thousands of students, and it completely changes the educational experience for our students. And many of our students have complained to us, and as they witnessed it this semester, that they did not learn as well, that it was too distracting, that is not the best way to learn, and the retention and graduation rates are much lower. They perform worse, even if we still preserve the small student to faculty ratio in an environment that is remote. So we have to think about, online education, one professor to hundreds and thousands. It's first of all, it's not for everybody. It's really more for an adult student who is at work, and it really doesn't lend itself to a successful undergraduate experience at large. Are there some students that benefit from this? Yes. Are we going to be ready to address those students? Yes. Marymount, we launched fully online programs. Our doctorate in education is fully online, and we have students for the first time this fall, as well as we're going to be putting some of our nursing program fully online. But is it as successful as what we're doing in Virginia right now? Without a question, no.
If I could just add a couple thoughts to that. I agree completely with Dr. Becerra. All of us are certainly increasing online programs, hybrid programs, where they make sense and where they work. I would point out that at least in some cases, when you really look at what's going on with some of these massive institutions with online, the graduation and retention rates are much lower than at institutions like ours. And so that's important to keep in mind, in terms of student success. I do think that there are certificate programs, adult learners, where it makes a lot of sense, where people, have the discipline, they can do this and they can't get back to a campus on a regular basis. But the biggest expense in higher education in many respects, frankly, is faculty. And what the students want and what leads to student success is that close faculty-student interaction. I teach right now, and I can tell you I've been in touch one-on-one with every student in my class. And if you've got 80,000 students, you're not going to be able to do that in the same way. So I think it's important to think about the quality of what we're providing, as well as how to use technology to enhance what we're doing.
Mr. President, thank you. I'm going to ask Delegate Keene if his question is a quick one, if we can squeeze it in.
Sure. Thank you, Fran. And for this question, because it is a little bit of a lengthy topic, I would ask if the campus is represented here as well as other campuses that may be following this, if you can provide us with either some kind of written answer or maybe some other conversation, because this is a very serious topic and an important one that we didn't get a chance to work on. It's about COVID. And I want to couch this by saying all of the higher education institutions have done the best you absolutely possibly can under an unprecedented circumstance. So this is not about finding fault or pointing fingers or going back and saying, you know, had we known something, because obviously none of us did. So I appreciate all that you've done, but I think there are some ways that we could try to improve. And after any situation, you know, having an after action review and making sure that you did what you did at that time and knowing what you know now and having more tools, how can we improve? And with colleges like schools, K through 12, you know, we get a chance to do over once the next semester opens up. The experience that I've seen, just as both as a parent as well as being on the higher education subcommittee over the last few months, was that some schools relied heavily on input and advice from professionals, whether it's from CDC all the way down to our state VDH. Others relied more on the local public health institutions and the organizations. Now, of course, the state and local public health institutions are supposed to coordinate, but given the uniqueness of your towns that are surrounding your schools, they were relying a lot on the local aspect to see what the phases were going to be as far as reopening and such. So my question is this, and we're not going to have a conversation now because it's going to take up a lot of time, but if you could also maybe contact me or to my colleagues, because as we're thinking about legislation for next session, what I'd like to do is ensure that we are addressing this gap or possible problems in coordination among the federal, state, and local public health institutions as it comes to your campuses. This is probably more for 4 years than 2 years because you're talking about students that are moving in and moving out. And this more specific problem that I'm facing is as students come back in the next couple of weeks to come back home to wherever they live, spend the next 3 months or so back home. And when they go back on campus in January, assuming that's what still the plan is, are we going to be ready the way you were not ready back in August, and the delays that we saw and the amount of integration that we had to deal with? And again, this is not about pointing fingers at any campus. I think any one of you have done as outstanding a job as you could possibly do under the circumstances. But knowing what you know now, and understanding the gaps that we had at both at the state level, at the federal level, can we ensure that we don't make the same mistakes again in January or February as we go back? And more specifically, because during the special session, we were not able to address any higher education legislation other than just funding issues. Are there some specific tools that you need or legal authority that you need in order for you to provide the best experience possible for students? Because unlike K through 12, when you're dealing with 4 years and 2 years, you're dealing with adults. You're not talking to the parents anymore. You're not talking to the parents to ask them what their permission is for your kids to come back to school. Now you're dealing with 18-year-old kids who, this might be the first time they're moving out of home. And all of a sudden you're asking them, okay, well, you're going to quarantine, you need to do this and this. So this is just a very difficult, unprecedented time. And I just want to make sure that us on the legislative side and you on the administrative side and all of us involved in this, that we make sure that we don't make any more mistakes than absolutely necessary in January. So if you can provide us with some written thoughts or maybe some follow-up conversations, that'd be great.
Great. Delegate Keem, thank you. And a thanks to each of our panelists and the members for their great questions. And since we're all in education, somehow it seems fitting that we've finished this panel with Delegate/Chairman Keem giving us all a homework assignment. So somehow that seems fitting. Patrick, I will turn it over to you with my thanks to the panelists.
Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary, and thank you to all of our presidents for joining us. This was a great session. Unfortunately, we don't have more time to keep diving in, but fortunately, we're going to move on to some other great resource experts that will help us think about some of these challenging topics that we started to talk about, understanding that all of this will require money and how we think about financing higher education is a challenge. Before we do that, I want to quickly turn it over to the co-chair of this summit, Senator Luis Lucas, to provide some welcome remarks this morning.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back today. Yesterday's discussions were quite revealing as a lot was covered, topics ranging from early childhood to educational diversity. The first discussion was a great way to get started as we pivot to a topic that we have been thinking about in the legislature. Higher education leaders are responding to COVID-19, funding higher education in an economic recession, creating strong post-secondary pathways, broadband expansion, and building a robust distance learning infrastructure. Yesterday's discussions were strong and informative as we set our priorities for the General Assembly. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Patrick. And again, good morning.
Thank you so much, Senator Lucas, and appreciate all you've done with Delegate Tyler to make this happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Lucas's colleague, Senator Jennifer McClellan, to provide some introductory remarks for this session, and then we'll get started with our panelists.
Thank you, Patrick, and good morning to everyone. It is a pleasure to see you all virtually here at the 2020 Virginia Education Summit. And although we cannot be together in person, at least we can still come together to discuss these important topics and share ideas on how the legislature can help serving the Commonwealth students well. As Patrick said, I'm Senator Jennifer McClellan. I represent the 9th district in the Senate, which is parts of the city of Richmond, Henrico County, Hanover, and all of Charles City County. And in this session, we are going to talk about a topic that has been on the legislators' minds, our minds, and a top priority for a number of years, but especially in the past couple of sessions. And that is, how do we make the Commonwealth's institutions of higher education affordable for all of its students? Making higher education affordable has always been a pressing issue, but with the COVID pandemic and the economic recession that has accompanied it, the issue has become an emergency for the Commonwealth as well as the rest of the country. And with many students in the Commonwealth and the country relying on their campuses for housing and food security, it's imperative that the Commonwealth make investments necessary to ensure that our higher ed students have both their academic and their non-academic needs met. So in this discussion, it will be important to address the cost share policy for higher education investment, seeing how in both good and bad economic times, the Commonwealth can increase its share in higher education investment so students don't have to pay as much out of pocket. Because as we saw in some of the discussion yesterday, crushing student loan debt and not having wages accompanying it is actually impacting our education workforce. And so each of these issues is interrelated. So I look forward to hearing from both in-state and out-of-state leaders who have experience in dealing with these important questions and how we at the General Assembly can address higher education investment in the upcoming 2021 session. Again, thank you all. And Patrick, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Senator McClellan. With that, I'm going to quickly get our resource experts engaged in this conversation so we can get moving. We're going to get to hear both a state and a national perspective, and we're going to start with that broader national perspective first. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Danette Howard, Senior Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at the Lumina Foundation, an organization that's been doing a lot to advance post-secondary attainment across the country. Dr. Howard, would love for you to start by just helping frame a little bit about the state of financing in higher education across the country to help us think about Virginia more specifically.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do so. Thank you very much, Patrick, and good morning to everyone. I'd first like to thank Senators Lucas and McClellan for their introductory remarks, the staff at the Hunt Institute for the invitation to join you here today, and the members of the House and Senate Education Committees for being here for this very important discussion. So I'm pleased to be here on behalf of Lumina Foundation and our state policy team, which is dedicated to helping all 50 states increase post-secondary attainment. Today, I'll share information about some of the trends we're seeing across the country, as well as a few thoughts we believe policymakers should consider as you're making higher education funding decisions in light of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, as a result of COVID-19, Between fiscal years 2020 and 2022, states are projected to experience dramatic budget shortfalls that top $550 billion. However, many of the state's higher education leaders we've spoken with recently have shared that current year cuts have not been as extreme as they'd anticipated, due in large part to the support from the CARES Act, but they do expect for the budget situation to become more dire as we enter 2021. In most states, higher ed is one of only a handful of discretionary line items in the budget, and therefore bears a disproportionate burden relative to state budget cuts during times of economic distress. History tells us, however, that such an approach has long-term negative impacts on both higher ed enrollments and completions, and a state's unemployment rate and the pace of the economic recovery within a state. So recently, Lumina Foundation partnered with the Gates Foundation and our colleagues at HCM Strategists to develop a framework designed to help legislators in making critical higher education budget decisions in the era of the pandemic. And I'd like to share just a few of the priorities included in that framework with you today. First, the framework compels policymakers to prioritize funding for institutions that have a positive track record of effectively serving Black, Hispanic, Native American, and low-income students, as well as to institutions that are positioned to be responsive to the needs of individuals in your state who've become unemployed or underemployed as a result of the pandemic, and will therefore need short-term education and training opportunities that will allow them to upskill and reskill. Now, the reality is that Virginia is one of the most educated states in the nation, but it also has some of the deepest and most inequitable attainment outcomes as well. So for example, our data show that while well over 50% of Asian and white Virginians hold at least an associate degree, those figures plummet to 35% or lower for Virginians who are Black, Native American, or Latino. Likewise, there are significant inequities across various regions in your state, with some counties having attainment rates upwards of 75 or 80%, while others have rates that hover near only 20%. Now, finally, there are nearly 1 million Virginians with some college credit but no credential, whose employment outcomes would likely be much improved if they were able to earn a credential of some kind. So senators and delegates, you have before you the ability to turn the incredible misfortune of the pandemic into a real opportunity for many Virginians. We therefore suggest that you think differently about higher education budgeting relative to how perhaps you've thought about it in the past, by rejecting the notion of a pro rata across the board institutional cut, and instead protecting institutions like community colleges, HBCUs, and regional comprehensive universities that effectively serve large numbers of individuals from the groups that I mentioned earlier, and from groups that have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And if and when possible, prioritizing new investments to those very institutions. Second, we suggest that you protect and expand need-based financial aid by reallocating, and again, when possible, increasing investments in this area, and that you commit to meeting the full costs of attendance for the most vulnerable students, even if that means reallocating funding or tapping into the state's rainy day fund. At this time, perhaps more than any other, students not only need resources to cover tuition and fees, but many are also in need of housing and food support, childcare and transportation assistance, and very importantly, access to mental health services. And finally, we suggest advancing strategies that support students' ability to actually complete credentials and that will allow them to get back into the workforce. This means prioritizing funding to institutions that offer and support the completion of credentials that are aligned to in-demand career opportunities in the state of Virginia. This will be an especially important and I think very effective strategy for workers who have been displaced as a result of COVID-19, as well as for those 1 million Virginians I mentioned earlier who have some college experience but no credential. So in closing, as you are making very important and very difficult budget recommendations over the days and weeks ahead, I encourage you to remember that supporting Virginians in earning high quality, employer-aligned credentials and prioritizing funding for the institutions that have proven to do this well is not just a higher education strategy. It's in fact an economic development strategy and an economic recovery solution. So thank you very much for your time this morning, and I look very much forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard. Next, we're going to turn to a more Virginia-focused expert. We'll be joined by Marge Connolly, who chairs the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, SCHEV. Marge, we'd love to hear from you a little bit about, specifically in Virginia, some of the work that SCHEV's been doing as it approaches higher education funding in recent years.
Sure, thank you. And I do want to echo Dr. Howard's thanks to all of you for spending this time and attention on this incredibly important topic. As I think all of you know, one of SCHEV's roles is to develop an overall plan for the Commonwealth and to set high-level goals associated with that plan. And ours is quite simply to become the best educated state. And we've defined that to be 70% of our working population having some form of post K-12 credential. Right now we're at 54%. We've seen a bit of progress, but obviously still a considerable way to go. And assuming that we get there, and I believe that we should. I think this is an investment in something that not only creates individual benefit, for those who actually receive the credential, but very much creates a benefit for the Commonwealth overall. There was a study a couple of years back by the Weldon Center that indicated that for every dollar that the state invested in higher education, there was actually a return of revenue increase of $1.92. So, almost doubling the money there. So, while we can't swear that exact correlation will continue as we increase the credentials that are obtained, I do think that kind of, pretty dramatic positive result is highly likely. So, I think we need to really think hard about how do we fund, because clearly if the numbers go up, the funding actually becomes bigger just because of that in and of itself. The good news is, we're starting from a pretty strong point. We have a very good higher education system in the country. In terms of attainment right now, we rank number 6. You'll actually see us get ranked 1 or 2 versus other states when kind of a broader set of metrics are looked at. So, I think we've got a really strong base to build on. And I do want to note, and I think you've heard this from other folks before, while it's true that Virginia is still behind some of its historic highs in terms of state investment, and we are lower than most states in terms of, again, state investment per student, I think it's really important to recognize that since the end of the Great Recession, there has been a steady increase in funding by the state. I think it's very important to note that, when things kind of came to a bit of a grinding halt here because of the pandemic, no cuts were made. And, in this last session, there's an additional $116 million that was invested, as well as, other things that were extremely helpful and greater flexibility in terms of how money is spent, the refinancing of debt. All of those things have been incredibly helpful. And I just want to personally say, I appreciate that, that investment and continued commitment to higher ed. I also do think it's important to note that on the other side of things, while we still definitely have a challenge associated with affordability, tuition increases over the last few years have been, in some cases, zero, and in other cases, very low relative to some of the again, historic numbers. So again, good news. I think it's fair to acknowledge that I think there are some suspicions that higher education is not efficient, and that costs have increased kind of above what would be considered reasonable. And just a couple of comments to that. Relative to other states, we do spend a little bit more per student. That is true. But because we have a very effective system, our cost per degree is actually better than average. And so, in essence, we rank 25th in terms of our spending. So right smack in the middle. So, we are basically investing, overall spend kind of down the fairway, but we're getting a superior result. So while I do think that there are opportunities to increase efficiency, I think if we only focus on the cost side of things, I don't believe that we'll get as far as we need to get in terms of creating access and affordability. So that then brings us to this question about kind of who pays for that cost, right? And right now we do have a cost sharing goal of the state funding 67%, students and parents funding the rest. Right now we're currently at 48%. So that's a pretty big gap between those two. In terms of relative to other states, we rank 39th, which not surprisingly then leads to us having a relatively high tuition and fee rate. We rank 15th in terms of highest tuition levels. And in terms of the percent of the cost relative to household incomes, right now it's about 47% of disposable income versus a national average of 42%. So, I do believe there is a case to be made for additional investment in higher ed. And I also think, though, it's fair that we think about that investment being aligned more precisely with specific goals, right? And I think those goals could vary. It could be related to student success. It could be related to equity. It could be related to better alignment with employer needs. It could be related specifically to tuition increase mitigation as it has in the past. But I do think overall there is a good case to be made that it would be a benefit both to individuals but the Commonwealth overall to increase our investment in higher education. I do agree completely that we have to look at this in terms of equity as well, not just overall funding. As was noted, as Dr. Howard noted, the disparities are pretty enormous. I mean, literally 20 percentage points. And, we have to close those gaps. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's absolutely necessary. There's no mathematical way for us to become the best educated state if we don't do a good job at decreasing the disparities that we see. And again, those disparities are by race, they're by region, they're by economic status, a variety of things. But again, I think we have to, every time we consider an investment, I think we have to kind of hold it up against those disparities and say, how will that help to impact, and decrease the gaps there? The last comment I'll make is just briefly on the immediate situation that we have at hand. As you've heard from others, the pandemic and associated recession has just created enormous financial stress on our individual colleges and universities. And, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. And yes, CARES Act money and the upcoming additional investment will help close that. Schools have been, finding, I think, innovative and sometimes difficult ways to close that gap as well. But, we do need to protect this gem. I think in the past, it has been believed that if the state needed to pull back significantly, that the money could be made up by raising tuition and by raising fees. And I just think, that has happened and we're a bit at an inflection point. 47% of disposable income doesn't give you a lot of headroom. And so, my hope is that we will find ways to create financial stability for universities in terms of state funding, so that we just don't create any risk of losing what I think is one of the thing that makes Virginia one of the best places for business, but also one of the best places to live in our country. So again, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Marge. With that, I'm going to open the floor to questions from our legislators. I certainly have my own, but I was trying to give you plenty of space. So I'll give you another moment.
I think Senator Barker has a question.
Senator Barker, is there?
There we go.
Yes.
Great.
Yes. Thank you very much for the presentation and moving forward on things. Right now, I just want to, I'm on the Senate Finance Committee along with Senator Lucas and Senator McClellan and several various House members. We actually are in reasonably good shape fiscally in Virginia. We're already exceeding the revenue levels that we had last year when there was no pandemic at this point last year. So we are actually in a position, we've just restored some funding that had been proposed back in March, was frozen for some of the additional funding that we incorporated in that budget. But now we have, with the special session that we ended with yesterday, we now have restored a fair amount of that. But and I think there will be substantial opportunities to do more in that respect when we're down in Richmond in January and February. So I think we're heading in the right direction, but I think what we need to do, particularly as it relates to things like higher education, is to try to make sure that we are, rather than sort of making just broad general funding decisions, to make targeted decisions that make sure that we get the most benefit for the resources that we have. That's where G3 and some of these other things may provide opportunities for doing something that really makes a difference in the lives of the people who can benefit from those types of programs. Our higher education system is generally rated on some of the annual rating things as either the best in the nation or the second best in the nation. So we do have a very strong public higher education system. What I think we need to focus on is some of the things such as the disparities as it relates to lower income students, to students who have had a less comprehensive high school preparation program, to the differences in geography that Dr. Howard referenced there, which is significant across Virginia, and some of the differences that relate to various racial and ethnic categories there. So I think all those are the types of things that we need to be able to target there to make sure that students get the best benefit and have the opportunity to be able to address some of those issues when they get to a higher education institution and are not put in a position where a substantial amount of them won't complete that higher education program and get a degree in the end. And I think any advice that anyone can give us to how to target some of those types of things. We did put some funding in for at-risk students and some of those types of things in the budget last year. Some of that was removed, but I think we will be able to get back to it. And I think those are some of the types of things we need to look at. And what we need is guidance in terms of helping make sure that we understand where we can get the most bang for the buck as it relates to both the education of the students and their job prospects for the future.
Right. Yeah, if I can just jump in. So I completely agree with everything you said, Senator Barker, and thank you. Yeah, and this is, you've heard, I think, this from some of the other folks who've spoken before, but I very much believe that financial aid is incredibly important. We did revise the calculation of how we allocated or how we recommended allocating financial aid last year. And so I think that does an even better job at recognizing the different missions of the various schools and the different student populations that they're serving. and so helps to, again, start to fill some of the, or bridge some of the gaps in terms of outcomes from some of the different groups that you were just citing. So, my encouragement would be additional investment in that regard. I do think the G3 program has some real benefit. And again, because we've got this short-term unemployment issue with some of these jobs not coming back, right? We know that we've got people who need to retool themselves so that they're more able to be successful. I do think there's an opportunity to enhance our ability to align programs with economic needs. I believe that we can create, I'll say, a data set and analysis that will be more compelling, that will help both students choose careers, but also help institutions determine programmatically how to best align. I think we have a lot of it out there, but it's very disparate right now. And I think creating a more robust and recognized capability would be an asset that all of our universities and colleges could benefit from. And I do believe there's an argument to, and this, I think we want to invest the time and energy to do this well, but our current base adequacy calculation is, I'm just looking at a note here, but we haven't changed that in about 20 years. And so my guess is that it is probably not picking up on everything from the different broad needs that various student groups may have in order to be successful, and may not be fully picking up on all of the costs associated with specific types of programs. And so funding some analysis to help us get our arms around that and perhaps improve that overall allocation process, I think could be helpful as well.
And Senator Baker, I would just add to and underscore some of the comments that you've already made regarding the targeted funding approach. So no across the board increases or cuts, but looking in a very intentional way about where those students from those groups that you just named, the lower income students, those students who have typically not shown up in our graduation cohorts, which institutions are they most likely to attend? And based upon the work that we see across the nation and in Virginia, they're much more likely to be enrolling at our community colleges, our regional comprehensives, our MSIs. And so we need to make sure that those institutions that have a track record of serving those students well get the resources that they need to not just continue to serve them well, but to do so at a rate that begins to make a dent in some of those kind of pervasive gaps that we see in the state of Virginia. Because I believe that you will get to your 70% goal without question. The question I think for all of you is, will you get to that goal by exacerbating the gaps or not changing the gaps? Or will you get to that goal by actually making a real difference and seeing those inequitable outcomes shrink?
Thank you both. Other questions? Okay. Hopefully I'm not missing anyone, but I will jump in with my next question. I'm wondering, Dr. Howard, you served as Secretary of Higher Education in Maryland, and could you talk a little bit about your experience there and how that informed your thinking with Lumina Foundation, and how some of your thinking and work during that time has influenced the way that you think about state higher education financing? What are some of the key lessons there?
Sure. You're right, Patrick. I was with the state of Maryland for 5 years prior to my role at Lumina Foundation. And one of the things that I wish I'd done a better job of getting a handle on was the extent to which enrollment projections actually influenced some of our budgeting and financing decisions. Because the enrollment projections often lagged what was happening in real time. And by the time those enrollment projections caught up to what we were seeing on the ground, so for example, Typically in times of economic recession, you see enrollments increase significantly at community colleges, but our enrollment projections took a couple of years to catch up with what was happening in reality. So I think that the idea of closely examining real-time data in terms of enrollment trends, in terms of also completion trends, not just of degrees, but of those short-term employer-aligned credentials, and making adjustments based upon that. So if different sectors of the higher education system are seeing enrollment booms, then how can funding be more quickly targeted to those areas to better serve the needs of students? And importantly, and I mentioned this earlier, thinking about the full cost of attendance beyond simply tuition and fees, but all of those costs that learners have to assume in order to be successful in higher education, but also then to be able to lead thriving lives, such as childcare. Food insecurity has become a big issue. And so thinking about those things as well as you think about costs that students have to bear.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. I'll pause for questions before I do ask another. Marge, I welcome some thoughts, and I know we're going to hear a little more about this in the next session, but as it relates to early college opportunities, so thinking about dual enrollment and other methods of preparing students, both thinking about what the financial impacts are there as well, both so that students come in with credits as well as they can maybe finish a little earlier. Just curious from Shev's perspective, what you all have been thinking about there and what role there is between that interplay of K-12 and post-secondary as it relates to financing of higher education.
Yeah, thank you. So first, in terms of some of these more affordable pathways, right? Whether that is dual enrollment, whether it is leveraging a community college for the first 1 or 2 years, it's been a complex process to really create an environment where that works, right? When I think too often students would take classes, have an expectation, and then find out that either they didn't count or they didn't count the way they thought they would, right, towards a specific major. And so there's been a tremendous amount of work to really kind of map the curriculum so that indeed students who make these moves actually end up getting the benefit. Still a lot more work to be done. It's a somewhat onerous process, but I do think that there is a lot of partnerships between community colleges and the local university that they might be near. We've got some, I think, tremendous role models. Think about Nova and George Mason, have really done, I think, a great job at doing this. And so I think we need to do more of that. I would love to see, find a way to kind of accelerate that effort. But, we do have good progress, and I do think it is a very valuable thing there. I also think there's a pretty wide disparity, or not disparity, there's a pretty wide range in terms of cost of different universities. And so I think we can do a better job at helping students understand, if affordability is something that is, very much top of mind here, how can we counsel you to know what are the options where affordability really, reigns supreme? And so I do think that there is a need for greater investment in outreach to the K-12 system, probably even earlier in terms of helping students understand what are the range of options. They are there, in most cases. And, but I think, right now we've got, 25,000 kids every year graduate from the high school and do not choose to do something next. Almost no new jobs are being created for, people with that level of education. And so really capturing them and getting them to make a choice, the one that's right for them, but something, I think is going to be vital. And clearly, that is a benefit to the higher ed system overall, because, we need we do have some demographics that'll be challenging coming up on the horizon. And, being able to kind of offset that lower overall high school graduation numbers with additional students making a choice to go on further, I think is going to be important, again, for the overall financial stability of the system.
Thank you, Marge. And I think Delegate Davis, you have a question?
Sure. I was wondering if some can speak to the future of what higher education looks like. So I know that transitions cost money, transitions take time. And I think the desire in some cases is to not just fund what we have today, but let's fund what higher education will look like in 20 years. So we're the leader when we get there. So can some of y'all speak to what does higher education look like in 20 years? Because I would venture to say that it looks nothing like it looks like today. Yeah, and so I'm kind of interested in some of those thoughts.
I can get us started. So many of you may have heard about stackable credentials. And that has been met with, I would say, a modest degree of success across the nation. What we're seeing now is a shift from the idea of stackable credentials to embedded credentials or credentialing as you go. So, for example, if someone is pursuing a bachelor's or associate degree, along the way, as they're taking their coursework, embedded within the curriculum are milestones where they will receive an industry recognized certification, a high quality certificate on the pathway to that associate degree and bachelor's degree. And so there is a nuanced difference between that credentialing as you go concept and the stackable credentials concept, which means you get one and then you layer another on top of that. With credentialing as you go embedded into the design of the program is that the learner will receive a credential at different benchmarks and milestones. And I'll say that Virginia's community college system is actually leading the way in terms of thinking about this concept. And what we'd like to see happen is for more legislators to incentivize institutions to design their programs around this credentialing as you go concept. We think that will be very beneficial to learners. You'll see an significant ROI on your investment. And that's also a significant way to bring back many of those learners with some college credit, but no credential.
And I'll just comment a bit on the need. I think it's important that we understand what the likely needs of employers are in the future. You know, what will the jobs of the future actually require in terms of skills and competencies, and ensure that we're kind of forward thinking in that regard as well. So, you know, it is, I think, likely, I think it's already here. Most new jobs require a degree of digital competency, for example. And so how do we ensure that that competency becomes part of the curriculum and, you know, as Dr. Howard said, potentially even credentialed along the way, so that we've got a clear signal to employers that indeed these students have what they are looking for. So, you know, I'll just do another pitch for this notion of creating a more comprehensive and robust capability associated with aligning higher education programs, including the underlying competencies with workforce needs. That's very much a part of what needs to happen, is not just to say where are the jobs openings today, but what are those employer needs going to be in the future?
Thank you, Marge and Dr. Howard. We are running short on time, but I do believe Delegate Davis has a quick follow-up question first.
Sure. So, and I appreciate it, and Marge, I really appreciate the comment of moving towards, you know, understanding what it is that businesses continually need in the workforce. To that extent, do y'all see a change in the curriculum requirements and credit requirements to get a college degree? I'll give you an example. We want to hold what our universities, I'm hearing, want to do is turn out employees ready for the workforce, the digital workforce, the high-tech workforce, and we're also trying to keep the cost of a college degree down. But to get a college degree, in almost all cases I'm aware of, you have to have a foreign language, and you're looking at 3 classes, at 300 a credit hour, which is 900 a class, which is $3,000 to take your foreign language requirement, which I would venture to say, and I've talked to some people that own large companies, they don't care about. So do we see a change in the requirements coming to get that college degree if we're going to try to merge this around what employers really want and care about?
Yeah, I think we will. I'm not going to pick on the language requirement specifically, but it is true. We want to get these kids through in a reasonable period of time, ideally 4 years. That does create certain constraints in terms of how much time they can spend on a variety of things. And so I do think that individual schools, I think individual programs will wrestle with this. I don't think these are easy decisions to make, but I do think that, again, if we create greater pressure from both the student body, right, who largely wants to go to school and get a credential so that they can have a better life, right? If we can create some pressure in that regard, and we can create some pressure based on good, solid data that says this is what's needed, I think we can influence those decisions. I don't think they're easy to make, and I can imagine some very energetic conversations within the universities as they work through that. But yes, I believe that can and will happen.
And I would just say, I really think that it depends. I think that there are certain credentials, and we talk about a spectrum of credentials, and there are those that have to be very tightly connected to workforce and employer outcomes. And we typically see this in terms of the shorter term credentials that are not at the threshold of a degree. We also think that degrees have to have workforce relevance such that the learner understands why they're pursuing the degree and that there are competencies built into degree so that the learner is able to show what he or she can do as a result of having gone through that degree pathway. But as we think about the longer term, your first question was about 20 years from now, we also want to make sure that in terms of our degrees, that our learners have had enough of a broad-based educational experience, that they have been exposed not just to the specific competencies that they need for any one job, but to the critical thinking skills, the ability to think, write, and reason that will allow them to be prepared for the next job and the next job, and also leadership positions within their field of choice. So I think that it is a much more nuanced conversation that needs to happen depending upon the type of credentials that are being considered.
Thank you, Dr. Howard, and thank you both so much for joining us today. I think that's a really good way to end on the reality that we know that this is an ever-changing landscape and it will only continue to change more quickly, and so we need to be thoughtful and proactive here. So very, very much appreciate both of you joining us for this discussion. We're going to give everyone a brief break. We will be back in about 10 minutes and we're going to get started at 10:45 sharp. We've got our resource experts already on the line and ready to join, so we look forward to that. Thank you again to Dr. Howard and to Marge Connolly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Newman, good to see you this morning.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for everything you guys are doing.
As always, we appreciate you. And Chancellor Oakley, good to see you as well. Still on mute there.
There we go. Good morning.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
And Peter, good to see
Pull
you.
my shade down here.
Thanks, Patrick. Senator Newman, good to see you.
Yeah. Hi, Peter. Good to see you, sir.
Chancellor, nice to see you.
Good morning.
We've still got a couple minutes before we get started, so just want to make sure I acknowledge everyone.
Is Louise on by chance?
She is.
Good. I love me Louise, so can't help it.
I love me some Steve also. He is
I
my
didn't know you were
favorite.
here.
You're my favorite senator, and I want to tell the world.
That's exactly right. You and me are together no matter what. So you look beautiful. Look at that background. Look at you. For goodness sakes.
I'm in my office in downtown Portsmouth.
Oh, are you? Okay, good.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
I've got, my normal attire on, but I put a jacket on just for you. So I'd look a little better.
Are we live to the public yet?
Yes, ma'am. We're still live.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say that Steve and I were seatmates for 12 years. And so even though he's a lot younger than I am,
Yeah.
he helped me out a lot on those times when I was out on a limb. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah. It's okay to be live and still tell everybody we love each other. We do. So that's
Yes,
just
I
the way
love
it
you.
is.
And you know it. Love you and your wife. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, sweetie. Yeah.
That's the bipartisanship we all like to see and appreciate at our meetings. We'll get started in about 1 to 2 minutes for those of you who haven't returned just yet. Okay, we may be a little bit early, but I would say, given how short our sessions are, it might be a good idea to get a little jump on it. So our next discussion around post-secondary transitions, we're excited to have that. Before we get to our resource experts, Senator Steve Newman is going to provide some opening remarks for us, and I'd like to again just acknowledge everything that Senator Newman's done to help make this summit happen for the number of years that it has, and certainly with his support in transitioning over to our new co-chairs, who we've been really excited to be working with. But with that, Senator Newman, turn it over to you.
Right. Patrick, thank you. And thank you for what you're doing to continue this process. I just want to say quickly, the Hunt Institute is a remarkable organization. This has been a bipartisan effort from the beginning and very educational, so very helpful. Thank you to Javed and Laura and others who have been involved, and Steve Landis, who helped pull us into this process. To Chairman Tyler, thank you for all you're doing and continuing this priority for the Hunt Institute. And to my favorite senator, Senator Lucas, thank you, Madam Chairman, for everything that you're doing. She is the best of the best. So with that, we will move next. Our two experts will be Peter Blake. Everyone on this call should know Peter and his extraordinary work that he's done with SCHEV for so long. And also Eloy Oakley, Chancellor of the community colleges. And thank you, Mr. Chancellor, for your work. You know, this season, this will be really an interesting discussion on a topic that plays a critical role in ensuring that students can be prepared for the demands of both the economy and also for the job skills in post-secondary pathways. As policymakers and members of the education committees and stakeholders, we must prioritize the creation and maintenance of strong post-secondary pathways for our students. I think all of us would agree on both sides of the aisle that one size simply does not fit all. Cross-sector partnerships between K-12, higher education, and the business community should contribute to relevant curriculum pathways that align workforces to what is needed in your geographic area. Individualized education plans and guidelines to students can many times start even in middle school. We don't want to restrict their choices, but at least they have pathways starting that early. And if we can do that, if we can identify their interests and skills and select courses and potentially internship experiences that explore different areas to help them prepare and advance for a more deliberative approach going into high school. We all know that COVID-19 has altered the status quo for education, not all in a positive way, but given these facts and the condition we live in, we must continue to figure out how to ensure that post-secondary programs and pathways continue to include dual enrollment, career and technical education, apprenticeships, our desire to help the military, workforce development, and others. And if we do this, we can continue to provide students with the skills and tools necessary to help them succeed and our Commonwealth succeed as well. With that, I'm looking forward to both the in-state and the out-of-state perspective in California and the work that's being done to help students continue to increase their education, earn degrees, or earn credentials that they are seeking to live their lives. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Patrick, and thank you again for all that you're doing for the summit.
Thank you so much, Senator Newman. Peter, we're going to start with you and hear from this Commonwealth perspective, and we'd love to hear what Chev is prioritizing, how you all are working on post-secondary transitions.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. And to the committee members, the chair, Senator Lucas, Delegate Tyler, thank you for pulling this group together and giving us all an opportunity to speak with you and be with you today. Senator Newman, appreciate your introductory comments. And I want to join Chair Connolly too in showing our appreciation for the support that you had for higher education during the most recently completed General Assembly session. I think Delegate Bulova pegged the number at about $180 million in federal and state support. I can't describe how far that goes to help shore up some of the finances at our institutions so that they, with the magnificent work they've done during a really difficult time, how that additional money is going to help them meet the needs of students across the Commonwealth. So thanks very much to that. And I'm excited to have Chancellor Oakley on the line. We did speak earlier in the week, and I think members will enjoy hearing from him. He oversees a system that has more than 2 million students. That's that's not quite 20 times the size of our community college system, but it's substantially larger. Yet I think there are opportunities that we can learn from him and his experience in that very complex and large system that certainly can apply to Virginia. So Patrick, again, thank you for bringing us together. The term pathways describes many opportunities for students to complete a degree or a workforce credential of value. Senator Newman already referred to many of them. They include dual enrollment, community college to university transfer, and stackable credentials. You heard that term used by Dr. Howard in the last sessions. Pathways also can include apprenticeship programs that align with academic degrees or undergraduate programs that have direct connections to graduate degrees. So there's a variety of ways when we use the word pathways that I'd like for members to kind of open their minds and think about all the possibilities. Through your leadership, students in Virginia have a variety of options to pursue credentials that best meet their situations. So Chev, March Connolly mentioned this earlier, we support pathways, I can think, for at least 4 reasons. One, they are affordable. Students can begin their education in high school, continue it through our lower cost community colleges, and complete their bachelor's degrees at one of our outstanding public or private universities. 2, they recognize differences in student experiences. Students approach higher education from many different angles, be it their communities, their high schools, their families, and personal situations that we may never know. Having multiple pathways leading to a degree or workforce credential enhances opportunities for more Virginians. It is a strategy for equity. Third, pathways give students options they might not have otherwise. In addition to offering students from different backgrounds to gain an advanced education, Pathways give students opportunities for rigorous education that they may not have had otherwise. High school students can get a college experience, and community college transfer students can follow program-specific pathways that lead to a high-quality credential in a high-demand field. And fourth, we support Pathways because they work. Transfer students generally perform better and graduate at higher rates than our native students. So thanks for what you do to support institutions and students in pursuing higher education through academic pathways. And I look forward to the conversation this morning.
Peter, thank you so much for that contribution, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions to follow up on those remarks. Next, we'll come to Chancellor Eloy Oakley from the California Community College System. As acknowledged, it is a very large system, but I think there are lots of great lessons that could transfer over to Virginia. So Chancellor Oakley, would love to hear more about your work and how you're prioritizing around the issue of post-secondary transitions.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you in representing the great Commonwealth of Virginia, and greetings from the Golden State. So first, let me just say that in my many years of experience in the community colleges, you all have outstanding community colleges, and I've had the pleasure of working with many of the leaders in your community colleges over the years. So kudos to the great work that they do in Virginia. So in California, you know, our issues, our challenges aren't too different than those in any state across the country. Some of the biggest issues that we're dealing with is the issue of equity. As our communities continue to diversify, as the need for post-secondary credentials continues to increase in the workforce, we have to pay very close attention to who is succeeding and who is not, and why. That's been the question that's been driving a lot of our work for the last decade at least. And so this question about transitions becomes very important because our community colleges, and I'm sure this is true in Virginia, our community colleges in California are the most diverse system of higher education because we are open access, and I like to say very proudly that our community colleges accept the top 100% of students. That's a privilege that we have in the community colleges. So then the question becomes, how do we support transitions from K-12 into higher education for those particularly first-generation students, and how do we support the transition into the workforce or into a four-year university? And so I've heard the discussions about pathways. Pathways is a critical part of any strategy. We in California have adopted the Guided Pathways framework for all of our 116 colleges so that we have one unified way of describing what a pathway looks like, so that when we work with our partners in the California State University system, the UC system, and our private nonprofits, we're talking about the same type of pathway. You know, in our institution, we've clearly recognized that low-income communities, particularly first-generation students, have struggled in our system. The Black and African-American community has struggled in our system, and certainly the Latinx community has struggled in our system. So we have really narrowed down into regions across the state that we have to lean into specifically. And even in this pandemic environment and the recession that has taken hold in California, it's only exacerbated the problem. We knew going into the pandemic that we already had a challenge with food insecurity, with housing insecurity for our most under-resourced communities, and that has only been exacerbated. The workforce has been changing. You've talked a lot about CTE. It's critically important that we really create a much clearer communication pathway between employers, particularly hiring managers, and community colleges and other institutions. So things like dual enrollment are critically important in this environment. We have to continue to build that. You know, we have become comfortable with the notion that getting to a high school diploma was the default to get into the workforce. That notion has really gone out the door. There should be really no separation between the 12th year of high school and the first year of college. We need to make that transition much more seamless, and dual enrollment is an important part of that. Certainly, you all have been talking about free community college, your G3 plan. We in California have the California College Promise. And while free college isn't the only thing in the College Promise, the College Promise is about lowering the cost of entry for low-income communities, creating partnerships with our K-12 districts, and then having clear articulation to universities. We have developed and continue to develop one transfer pathway to all of our four-year partners. So whether a student goes to a community college in Northern Virginia or Central Virginia, the pathway should be very much the same. And I know it's a little bit more difficult in Virginia, but we've seen great success in improving the transition when we can do that. So I will stop there and again, just say thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to engage in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Chancellor. And I'd like to open the floor to legislative questions. I have one immediate follow-up if there's not an immediate question as well. Senator Hashmi.
Thank you, and thank you to both of our speakers. I just had a question for Peter. Peter, we had implemented the stackable credentialing programs. It's been a few years now, and I was curious if we have data that shows how it's working, which populations in particular have been affected, and how students are able to transition from the diploma to certificate programs, and then perhaps even to transfer degree programs.
Thank you, Senator Hashmi. Good morning. That legislation was, I guess, from 2017 or 2018. There's been a couple of different significant pieces of legislation that have come out of the General Assembly affecting transfer. And so you may be talking about the passport program and the 30 credit program as well, the general certificate. So we are in the process of implementing that. So I don't have any data yet to show you the impacts that has had. But again, back to my opening comments, I have to believe that some clarity around what is and what is not accepted will contribute meaningfully to closing some of the gaps that the Chancellor mentioned earlier, in which we experience here in Virginia. But as we get those data, we certainly will present them to you and then seek other kinds of strategies to kind of round it out to make sure that it is accomplishing its purpose.
Thank you, Peter. I have a couple questions coming in. I know that we have I've got Delegate Marshall next, and then Delegate Robinson. And so you have a question too, we'll come to you after Delegate Marshall. Oh, Delegate Marshall, we can't hear you for some reason. Still can't hear you, I'm sorry. Okay, all right, so you'll type in the question. Delegate Robinson will come to you, and then I'll make sure I read out Delegate Marshall's question.
Thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So my question would be, does California have the same broadband challenges that we have in Virginia? And if so, how are they addressing that?
Well, hopefully Virginia doesn't have as bad of a broadband problem as California. For being the golden state, the technology state, we have a huge issue with broadband, particularly in low-income communities and rural communities. That has been a very sore point that has really been highlighted because of the pandemic. As you can imagine, we have a huge K-12 system. Many students, many low-income students have tried to gain access to their education materials, and because of the lack of access to broadband, it's been a challenge. We have been working with Governor Newsom and the legislature to make this a priority in the next legislative session. We have gathered and had several meetings with all of the internet service providers in California to, in the immediate term, create access, low cost, if not free access to low-income students. And so we've tried to band-aid the problem in the near term, given the length of this pandemic, given the length of the need to be online or virtual for the foreseeable future, and really the importance of leveraging what we've learned in this pandemic. We need to increase broadband access, and I believe that given the outcry in California, this will be a priority in the next in the upcoming session for the governor and the legislature.
Peter, is there anything you'd like to add around broadband in Virginia?
Well, thanks, Patrick. I know you have a whole session on that coming up, so you might just save some of the questions, but broadband is a broad term for many different complex issues, including cost and availability, but also, devices and the environment in which you use those devices to access education. And it just, the COVID pandemic has just made that so much more complex and difficult, but also more important of an issue for Virginia to address from, as I said, many different angles. And I'm sure you'll pick that up in your next session.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate that. Next, Delegate Marshall, apologies for any technical challenges here, and I'll make sure I read your question verbatim, and please feel free to chat in any clarifications that you may have. Question was around if California offers 2- and 4-year programs, and is community college free for all students, or is there some other way of determining who receives free community college?
Right. No, I think that's an important question, because there's a lot of flavors of College Promise or free community college programs throughout the country. California is a first dollar program, first of all. So tuition is automatically waived for every low income student in California. And there is a specific threshold how we define low income, as well as we waive tuition for all first time full-time students. So if you're a low income student, tuition is waived. If you get beyond that threshold, but you are a first time student that is attending full-time, we waive your tuition. In addition, many of our colleges, through supportive philanthropy, have been able to waive tuition for every single student, regardless of income status. But the state program is, at this point, the largest and most generous first dollar program, and it does apply to all community college students, regardless of whether they're pursuing transfer, CTE, or just an employer certificate. For the 4 years institutions, there is, through the Cal Grant system, which is California's financial aid program, support for transfer students as well. But at this point, the California State University and the University of California do not offer a similar state tuition-free program.
Patrick, this is Delegate Tyler. I have a question that I would like to ask Mr. Oakley. You mentioned that you had a program similar to our proposed G3 program. Has this program been successful?
So in California, we feel it's been very successful. We began very much localized. So the institution that I came from before I became chancellor was the Long Beach City College. We had instituted our own free tuition program around the same time, or just around the same time that President Obama launched the America's College Promise. We use models like the Kalamazoo Promise, the Tennessee Promise, El Dorado Promise in Arkansas to model that. So many communities had already created. And so we have a long track record in those communities of showing that it increased access to low-income students, to students of color, and coupled with the partnership with the K-12 districts in those communities, it has really helped many low-income students not only gain access, but support them through finishing their educational goals. The key that we've learned is the tuition piece isn't the only piece that has to be included. There has to be support for low-income students as they enter college. And then there has to be incentives to K-12 partnerships and partnerships with the four-year universities. So this has got to be a comprehensive program in order for, in our view, I mean, our goal was to increase completion, not just access. And so far we've seen success.
Thank you. Senator Hashmi, I think you had another question.
Thank you. And I think, Chancellor, you've already kind of answered it, but my question was really focusing around the first dollar programs, and especially for those vulnerable students. We know data shows us that if students are able to go full time, especially our vulnerable populations, we do have higher completion rates. And I think you've indicated your data showing that within these vulnerable populations, we're seeing higher completion rates in California then?
Yes. So in the California community colleges, we've seen increases in completion and the closing of equity gaps across the system. Having said that, it has become clear, particularly in this pandemic, that the greatest barrier to completion for low-income students is the financial hardship. So in our case, and I think this is bearing out across the country, you've seen a dip in enrollment in community colleges, and that is directly correlated with the loss of jobs of our students, the loss of hours, the fact that many of them are adult learners, they have children who are also at home trying to learn online. So all these things have really created a huge barrier for student completion, and that's where we're focusing our efforts in our financial support.
And Chancellor Oakley, we had a quick follow-up as well from Delegate Marshall regarding the First Dollar program, and just asking, is it the same in all parts of California? Are there regional or institution differences?
The state commitment is uniform across the entire state. So whether you're on the Oregon border or on the Mexico border, it is the same. Different communities have added on top of that. Again, I'll use the example of Long Beach. It has made the program even more comprehensive. And those are what you'll find in California. The regional differences are caused by regions or cities adding on top of what the state already does.
Thank you, Chancellor. And Peter, would you want to jump in and talk a little bit about how Virginia is thinking about the first dollar versus last dollar differences, and understanding, of course, budgetary constraints factor into this in a large way, but how you're trying to prioritize that?
Yeah, quickly, and there have been several references to the governor's proposed G3 plan that went through some modifications in the legislative session. It's aimed at particularly low-income students, so it does have an income strata to it, and also in high-demand disciplines. So it's not as broadly applied as what the Chancellor described in California, open to all students and all programs. So it was more narrowly focused. So it has a combination of first dollar and last dollar as well, because in addition to making sure that it covered tuition, but it also had an add-on. It had a provision that a student could get a little bit of extra money for other kinds of expenses other than tuition. So there are lots of lessons one can learn from all the different programs. You mentioned Tennessee Promise and a host of others, and as well as community-driven programs such that provide low-cost, free community college tuition. So I think the key in Virginia is to get something going, and then we can build on it and round it out and make it more perfect.
Fair enough. And I think we even saw Tennessee Promise start as one of those regional programs as well and grow out to support the full state. Any other immediate questions right now? I would like to ask a question that builds on our last conversation, a question that Delegate Davis asked, and it's about that importance of aligning for the workforce and ensuring that we're preparing for the workforce of today and tomorrow, and that your graduates are able to both immediately enter the job market and be adaptable as we go forward. How are you all thinking about this in your institutions and supporting that kind of conflicting challenge that you have to face?
So I think that is, I think you described it well. There is a conflict in there. And I think for us in California, we are wrestling with that conflict. We recently created a brand new college that is fully online, competency-based only, focused on adult learners who need to be reskilled or upskilled to get into the workforce. That is our first experiment with moving from a traditional higher education model, which is create curriculum, ask students to sit in our classrooms for several semesters and then transition to the workforce. We're trying to reimagine how that relationship works and make it more real time. I think that's the key for us in higher education. We are moving too slow for the needs of the workforce. By the time we catch up with the changes in the workforce, we're creating programs for the jobs of yesterday, not the jobs of tomorrow. So that is a tension that we're working through. And I know that your previous guests, Danette Howard from Lumina and other institutions are working with systems like ours to expedite that tension and to get us working a lot faster, because I think that's a critical issue. We will continue to have the traditional role of transfer, and that's great, but we have to do a much better job of preparing individuals to get into the workforce as quickly as possible, and then stacking those credentials so that individuals can continue to earn their way toward a higher level degree. But in the near term, they've got to get to work, and those jobs are requiring some sort of credentialing.
So I muse on this a little bit, whether it's more acute now than it has been ever before. And maybe it is, but certainly it's something that, as Chancellor pointed out, there is a tension, and I think we grapple with it in different ways. So it comes back to the conversation then about pathways and the variety of options that we have. And so should one want to take I'll call it a more traditional path, one can, and if one wants to take a shorter term, more focused workforce outcome path, one can. In Virginia, we've invested pretty substantially in the last several years on what we call the non-credit side of community college education. And these are short-term, often customized credentials that are needed in the short term for a job and employment. And we have seen tremendous returns, particularly for the lower income Virginians who get these credentials and are able to substantially increase their income. So again, I think our pathways allow for some of that. I'm thinking back to Senator Hashmi's question earlier too about the passport program, which is 16 hours, and the Uniform Certificate of General Studies, which is 30 hours. This actually puts together a program of study. As the Chancellor of Virginia used to say, Glenn Dubois often still does say, is that if you have something coherent, like 16 credits or 30 credits that lead to a certificate, it's much more valuable than what he calls a bag of credits. And our system of pathways in the past has been around a bag of credits, and whether and how you can assemble them without any real clarity to the student or the family or even to the institution of how that fits together into something that's meaningful and has value in the workforce. So I think all of this, and however Delegate Davis imagines the future of higher education, and I love his questions, lend credence to pathways and alternative ways to achieve success in Virginia or in California.
Thank you. Other questions right now? So the discussion is around post-secondary transitions, and we have two major points where that occurs, both as it goes from K-12 into post-secondary, be it 2 or 4 year, and then potentially from 2 year to 4 year as well. One of the main challenges within that is credit articulation and ensuring that you can transfer credits. What are the main challenges there? What are you all doing to help ensure that credits are transferable in both of those transition points? And what are some of the things that we should be thinking about to help make that a little more easier for students going forward so that it's something that doesn't hold them back?
Well, I'm happy to jump in first. I mean, this is one of those topics. I have several topics that get me on a soapbox. This is one of them. This whole notion of the way of credit articulation is so antiquated. It is, in many ways, a systemic barrier to so many students who need to get into higher education and need to get into the workforce. And I'll just take the military, for example. And obviously Virginia has a lot of military personnel who are interested in continuing into higher education. We do, as a country, a terrible job of articulating military experience. I mean, I spent time in the military, almost none of my experience in the Army transferred to my community college. And so credit for prior learning is something that we need to significantly scale up, in my opinion. Competencies are key here, and the more that we can articulate competencies rather than just seat time or credits is critically important. And I think that what's happening across the country is a change in, and not that I ever see degrees going away, but there is a breakdown of the degree into the kinds of competencies that students are actually picking up. And this kind of work will help us better articulate across all systems and across to employers, because it's not just articulating from K-12 to community college to a four-year university. How do we articulate that learning to employers? And I think that's where we've fallen short over our history. And I think that's where a lot of the work is happening now. And I'm hopeful that we can significantly improve that over the next few years.
Patrick, I'll jump in and just say what the Chancellor just described is really hard work. These kinds of program matches and getting the faculty together and working on the curricula in a way that it is articulated in a more seamless way that's meaningful for students is hard work. And I think someone mentioned the advanced program between Northern Virginia Community College and George Mason University a little while ago. And that took, I mean, I don't know, months and months and months of faculty to get together to identify those pathways. So we've been very fortunate coming out of the 2018 legislation that I mentioned earlier to hire a woman named Patricia Parker, who's leading Transfer Virginia, our initiative to do some of those program maps. And we identified the leading largest programs from community colleges that could transfer to universities and are beginning to sit down with faculty in all these disciplines: engineering, education, computer science, business, psychology, sociology, social work, human services, health, biology, chemistry, physics, math, environmental science, marine science, and geology. For example, that's phase one. And the amount of time and effort that it takes to put into this. So it is the right thing, it is the right question. And I just want to kind of urge some patience on this and you know, whatever kinds of assistance that you can lend to the system, to the institutions, to the faculty that really are earnestly doing the right thing at the right time. I would just urge that.
Patrick.
Senator Newman.
I'm going to just follow on that because I think it's critically important. Patience is important, and Peter is so fantastic with the work that they're doing. But you know, we're different in California in a lot of good ways and a lot of ways that really make us struggle, right? Because we struggle because we don't have a system, right? California has a system of their colleges that really does. You can get a bit of a push down approach. Ours has got to be a bubble up approach, but it means that to the General Assembly and our great chairpersons and the Finance Committee and Appropriations have got to keep pushing on this, because we've got to get these independent public colleges to agree to things that aren't in the nature, and they're hard. But I think that it's meant that Virginia is behind the curve on this, and we need to continue to have the leadership to get us where Peter and so many others want us to go. And that is that this has got to be seamless. This has got to be something that our dear friends at UVA can't opt out of, or XYZ college. We've really got to make sure that all of our college and universities and our community colleges are in line with our colleges. It's got to be high quality, but it's something that's going to take all of us to continue to push on, and patience certainly, but we've got to make sure that there's strong leadership, or we have a chance of not getting there. So I want to make sure that we all understand that's a big responsibility and leadership push from us.
May I jump in, Patrick, on that? I agree, Senator. I guess I have two questions, one comment and one question. The institutions that handle that have the most transfer students are Old Dominion University, Virginia Commonwealth, and George Mason. And then James Madison, UVA, Virginia Tech round that out. And among those institutions, they're addressing, I don't know, something like 75, 80% of transfers. So as we prioritize how we do this in the state, I think there's opportunities to focus on those institutions that serve the most students in this way. And others will come along, but there's some huge opportunities in particularly those three largely urban institutions, Old Dominion, Mason, and VCU. But Senator, to your question, and I'd like to get Chancellor Oakley's comment on this. Yes, California has a more of a coordinated system than we do in Virginia with independent boards that we have. But I bet you run into some challenges too on that. And maybe there are some lessons that you could give Virginia that has largely independent institutions on how you might deal with that.
Well, we certainly run into problems. I mean, there is a culture of, you know, I don't want to put this in a negative way, but, you know, the higher you go on the food chain in the higher education system, the less likely you are to look down at the other institutions and think of them in the same way or think of them as part of your future. So that's part of the cultural change that we've tried to create in California. I think a big step has been, look, I mean, R1 institutions are only focused on looking at other R1 institutions. University of California, Berkeley is no different than UVA. It's hard to get their attention and get them to focus on creating clear transfer pathways for community college students. But, you know, the governor, previous governors, Governor Brown, Governor Newsom, the legislature have all been working together with the system leaders to bring them together. So I meet regularly with the president of the University of California, with the chancellor of the California State University, with some of the presidents of the independent nonprofit institutions, you know, the Stanfords, USCs, things like that. And we try to make a commitment to work together. It's also been beneficial. For example, Governor Brown appointed me to the board of the University of California Regents. And the reason for that is to bring the perspective of a community college transfer student and the importance of transfer to the table. So there are different ways that you can encourage that, but it is a difficult issue. And I think we just all have to commit to raising the value of community college transfer students into these institutions, which I think really benefit from the diversity that comes from our community colleges.
Great. Thank you both. And thank you, Senator Newman, for jumping in there. Delegate Mugler, I believe you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. On the same topic, you know, I do think we have an obligation in Virginia to make sure that we figure this out because we've been talking about this for a very long time. I know I worked as an admissions officer a long time ago. I'm not going to tell you how many years because then you'll know how old I am. But at any rate, I mean, we were working on that 30 years ago. And, but today we're talking in Virginia about the 2+2 program. And, you know, we really tout that as a real thing. And so when families engage in placing their young people in community colleges, and they have that expectation that that 2+2 really means that. And then they're disheartened to find out when they get their student placed at a four-year institution that oftentimes some of those credits are not transferring over. So, you know, if there are ways for us to accelerate that, and there are ways for us in the legislature to support that, please communicate it to us so that we can help you get there. But I do know, you know, it is a piecemeal, one-by-one curriculum review, and it's very complex and complicated work. But I do think that we need to get there, and certainly I think that we're committed to getting there.
Thank you, Delegate Mugler. Let me just add one thing. Again, coming out of the legislation from a couple of years ago, you directed the community college system to put together an online portal that, and I've mentioned the word clarity 2 or 3 times, I'll mention it again, and I think it's to your point. And the benefit of having this portal is that it would have these pathways and the matches and make it clearer than it has been in the past on the path that a student would need to take in order to maximize the benefit of his or her community college education and dual enrollment from high school. So I think there are many things that you have put in place, and we're now in the process of implementing them, that we hope, again, will move this substantially forward. So thank you for that.
Delegate Keane, we have a little bit more time, and I'll turn it over to you for the last question, comment.
Sure, just a very quick comment and then a question, not necessarily for a conversation, but just for us to be thinking about. First of all, thank you, Chancellor and Peter, for joining us today. The Chancellor and I were just messaging each other about my background. I actually grew up in California when I first immigrated to the U.S. And so I'm a product of California public schools before moving to Virginia. So I'm very familiar with both the UC and the California State University system, as well as the community college system there. The big difference between Virginia's and the California system from a public school perspective, as Senator Newman so correctly pointed out, we have, obviously, depending on how you look at it, there are positives and negatives of either system. There's no perfect system. But the one thing that's different is that in Virginia, for our four-year college system, we actually have independent boards and visitors. Whereas with our 2 years, we have a statewide system. So that's a little bit of the hybrid where we have a VCCS that's kind of like the middle bureaucratic management for the campuses for community colleges. Whereas with the 4 years, they're all independent. So in some ways, we have a best of both worlds or worst of both worlds, depending on how you look at it. So that's something that I've been talking about in my higher education subcommittee of how do we keep what we have, but also learn lessons from other schools that are other states that are doing a good job, and see if there might be ways that we can try to reform. But a bigger conversation going forward is, and I hope this is not seen as a political conversation at all, but assuming that President Biden becomes president in the next couple of months, his wife, as we all know, our very dear friend, Jill Biden, happens to be a Northern Virginia Community College educator. She's been teaching with our school system for many, many years now. And she allegedly has said that she's going to continue to teach, which is a great thing for us. Maybe a security nightmare for some of us in Northern Virginia, but it's certainly a good positive direction for us to have the sitting first lady teaching on one of our campuses if she chooses to continue at NVCC. So the question here, and I guess this is for us to be thinking about as policymakers, under that scenario where you have an administration that's going to be focused very closely from a high priority on the needs of higher education, and as Chancellor mentioned, she rolled out, along with President Obama at the time, the America's Promises initiative, assuming that she makes that one of her priorities, are there some opportunities for us to do that cross-state national collaboration so that we can bring all of our community colleges and the four-year leadership together so we can really learn lessons, especially now that the pandemic has created a whole different dynamic. And earlier in the day, we talked about how nobody really knows what's going to happen in the future. But one thing we do know is that we have to be flexible and be ready for what changes happen. And rather than all of us struggling to get separately, if there's a way that we can all collaborate, work together, and try to learn from each other's experiences and develop something, especially when it comes to online education, which is going to be the key place, and then broadband, of course. So I think there's an opportunity here, and I look forward to just staying in touch with all of our colleagues across the nation as we struggle with this together and create the best system for the entire country. But anyway, thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Delegate Kamen. I would like for some final reflections, but really briefly, I want to come to Delegate Guy because I apologize that if I didn't see your hand earlier. But if you'd like to quickly ask your question, then we can have final reflections from our two resource experts.
This presentation has been very informative, and obviously it's about the transition from K-12 secondary education into higher education. But at some point, I think we need to talk about the back-end transition from higher education to workforce, which is, as we all recognize, ultimately our goal. And Delegate Davis really honed in on that, that it's going to start looking different. And as a parent, I have to say that my children have very easy time with the transition from secondary education to higher education, but the higher education to workforce was much more difficult. And we are going to have to start looking at how we change higher ed to ease that transition in terms of what really is demanded of people in the workforce. And I don't know if anybody wants to comment on how we should be doing that, or if that's another panel for another day, but That's our ultimate goal. So we can't just stop after we get them into college and then think once they get out of college, the problem's taken care of.
Thank you. Peter, it looks like you're ready, and then Chancellor Oakley will.
Well, I was just going to say thank you. Yes, that's very important. Probably a topic for another panel or another day, but I look forward to following up with you, Delegate Guy.
Chancellor Oakley, anything you'd like to add to close us out?
I would just say that to the last question, yes, with an exclamation point. The connection between higher education and employers is a critical piece. We need to significantly improve that. And the more that we can improve the way that we articulate what students learn, the competencies that they obtain over time in our systems, the better off. And then I have to close by saying, regardless of what side of the aisle you come from, or, where you are on issues of higher education, I continue to believe that community colleges are the place to look and invest. I mean, it is such a wonderful system across America. And the one thing that I know of every community college is they're there for the same reason, to support every member of the community and to get them higher up in higher education and connected to employers. So I hope whatever you do, you look to your community college system there in Virginia, which is an excellent system.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining us. This was a really rich conversation. And again, we will be capturing some of these things in our key takeaways. So we'll follow up soon. Thank you again. With that, we're going to pivot to our last discussion here. We are fortunate to be joined by someone who is making quick time before having to go into surgery. Senator Donovan, we really appreciate you making some quick time for us before the lunchtime surgery. So this discussion will be around remote learning and access. We'll get to hear from a district leader here in Virginia who's doing great work, and then hear a national perspective on this topic. But first, I will turn it over to Senator Donovan.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Sorry to be dashing in and out, but I just had patients already scheduled, and with the amount of time we've been out for special session, I couldn't reschedule patients. But this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I think there's some important things that we need to think about and talk about as we look at remote education and virtual education. One is that I know you're going to talk on is the accessibility, and I'm sorry for the background noise, but it's the accessibility of broadband. And we have a research study that was done by Chev, and it tells us more than 200,000 of our K-12 kids in school and more than 60,000 college students lack access to broadband in the home. That's a problem we're going to have to solve, because it's not just about broadband, about school, it's about actually being at work and making that happen for so many families across Virginia. And I know we're working hard to do that, and we funded more money this way, even in special session. As far as virtual education is concerned, we have had a makeshift kind of collage of virtual education that came together during this COVID crisis. What I really hope we're going to see as a value in Virginia for virtual education is a very standardized curriculum that's available, and that requires more than just broadband. We need to utilize the platform that we have. We looked at bringing on board a new platform, but Virtual Virginia has a platform that's Canvas-based that we can cover. But really having a robust library of virtual learning curricula on that single platform is what's going to give Virginia a lot more nimbleness in being able to reach kids with consistently high value educational opportunities, whether it's math or other things, being able to have a platform. Do you know that right now in Virginia, because our 132 school divisions have a variety of different platforms that they're using, teachers are trading lesson plans on Pinterest. It may be a little bit better now, but also it makes it very, very hard for them to tap into kind of lesson plans that are pre-made and are the standard that we're looking for. So having that single platform and that robust library of curriculum that's been worked on with Virtual Virginia is going to be really, really important. So those are a couple of things that I think we can talk about, and that's really how we get it. We have to have the library, We have to have the platform. We have to have teachers trained. We need to invest in training teachers and making sure that they can share that information. And then we need to be able to get it into the kids' homes. So I hope that's enough of a kind of flyby intro. Is there more you'd like to know about?
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Senator Donovan, and good luck with your upcoming surgery.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry to get in and out. And this is a near and dear subject to my heart. So let me know what you figure out.
We will figure everything out. Let you know. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So first, to start a discussion, we're going to start with the national perspective. We'll come to Catherine DeWitt, who's the manager of the Broadband Research Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Catherine, I know Pew's doing a lot around broadband access and expansion, and we'd love to hear some from you about the national landscape. What are some states doing to help with this issue? What is the federal government doing to support? But broad overview would be very helpful to get us started.
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for having me today. It's always a pleasure to talk to the great delegates and legislators from the state of Virginia. In case you weren't aware, we at the Broadband Research Initiative are big fans of what the state is already doing on broadband access, and you are a state that we often point to when people say, how do we do it right? We point them your direction. So I am happy to offer a little bit of insight on kind of what trends we're seeing across the country, and then of course take whatever questions y'all have related to really anything that we're talking about today. So just briefly for the heads up, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Pew Charitable Trusts, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. Our job is to provide policymakers like yourselves with data and analysis to help solve complex policy problems. Of course, one of those is broadband, which is why we're here. My team has been examining how states are addressing the digital divide. We've looked at that primarily through the scope of two different analyses. The first is a national review of how states are addressing broadband in policy. We've published those findings in a tool that we call the State Broadband Policy Explorer. I can send all these links to you after the event, Patrick, for distribution. So if you have any questions about how different states are addressing things like broadband programs, access to infrastructure, competition and regulation, all of that is captured in the Policy Explorer, and we're also happy to answer specific questions if you have them on specific pieces of policy and statute. The other thing that our team has done is do extensive field research on 9 case study states. I can share I'll share the findings from that research in a little bit. But we looked at 9 states across the country, including Virginia, and these are all state programs that had been around or had been operational for at least 2 years. They were actively funded. All of these states were also in various phases of implementation. And not every state program looks the same. I think it's really important for me to just kind of frame remarks at the outset with that state initiatives need to look like the state. They need to be very conscious of the digital divide that is unique to that state, to what their specific stakeholders within the state need, what their state economy is, and what that economy needs as well. So again, I can go into a little bit more detail on that later, but I think generally the big takeaway from our research is that states are doing more. Which you're probably all like, wow, great, thank you for that really insightful observation. But they truly are. I think that the fascinating thing is that states really have not gotten a lot of attention for all the progress that they've made in bridging the digital divide, particularly over the last decade. And increasingly, really since 2017, we were seeing more states appropriate more funding, to their broadband efforts. They were also starting, we saw a significant uptick in legislative activity in 2017. And we saw significant budgets, additions to budgets even before COVID for broadband. And even as we entered into this public fiscal crisis, and as states were deciding how to spend CARES Act funding, broadband was still a priority. The interesting thing about the CARES Act funding in particular is that we were seeing a lot of sort of the short-term responses like funding for hotspots, device access, affordability offers, things like that. But we were also seeing states think a little bit more about how they could spend that funding on longer term solutions. So how could they either supplement existing infrastructure initiatives or stand up new ones in order to make sure that people actually had connections in the long run? Briefly, state broadband programs really do 4 key activities. So they engage a diverse set of stakeholders, both within the private sector, the public sector, and at the community level. They're responsible for data management. We talk a lot about the map at the FCC and why the map is bad. Yes, that is a big component of what state programs do, but state broadband programs are also responsible for additional types of data management. Again, I can get into that. States also perform statewide, regional, and local planning. And those planning initiatives are really important to help set a framework for where the state is going and help position communities and regions for funding. The final component is, of course, states administer grant programs, including the state of Virginia. I can take questions on federal programs and kind of what those look like, but I think our key message when it comes to the feds is that feds can actually learn a lot from what states are doing. And specifically, states have really narrowed in on the fact that it's not going to take one policy or one program to solve the digital divide. You know, the easy stuff has been done. So what it's going to take now is a combination of efforts. We're talking policy, we're talking funding, we are talking planning, stakeholder engagement, all that stuff that I just outlined. It takes a combination of those efforts in order to make meaningful progress. So that's really the key thing that we think that federal initiatives can learn from state programs. But there are a couple of other things that I'll flag quickly before turning the mic back over to Patrick. The first is that states are increasingly funding scalable networks. What does that mean? It means that funding recipients are required to demonstrate that the technology that they are receiving state funds for can be upgraded to meet future needs as speed needs increase over time. For example, in the state of Minnesota, the state has a statewide goal of all homes and residences, or all homes and small businesses, excuse me, having access to 100 down and 20 up by 2026. And every recipient of public funds needs to be able to demonstrate that the technology that they are receiving public funding for has to be scalable to a symmetrical connection of 100 down and 100 up. I realize I just threw a lot of jargon at you, so if you need me to unpack that, I can. So scalable technology, higher speed goals. I just touched on that with Minnesota. Washington has a similarly aggressive speed goal as well. Affordability was something that came up before COVID. We think affordability is going to be something that both states and feds will increasingly focus on in the coming years. But what we've seen at the state level that's notable with respect to the affordability discussion are states thinking through, how do we really address this systemically? Not just if we're going to provide a subsidy, what does that subsidy look like? Is it a subsidy? Does it need to be something else? And I think that there are no clear policy steps yet, but we are seeing really thoughtful discussions about how to address the affordability question and make sure that folks can get online no matter what their financial situation is. The final piece is, especially when we talk to feds about what they can learn from states, is really improving the collaboration between state government and federal governments. Virginia has actually been out in front on this as well. But what we really see are that state programs are often so oversubscribed. The demand for the state funding support is significant and often significantly surpasses the amount of funding that's available. What we would like to see more of is where the federal government can help complement existing state initiatives. Where are the shovel-ready projects that the state just wasn't able to fund, where maybe federal funding can help close that gap and accelerate the rate of connectivity. So I'm happy to take more questions later on. Patrick, I realize I'm way over time, but hopefully this provided a valuable framing for the rest of the discussion.
I did ask you a very big opening question in your defense, so that's understandable. But thank you for that, Catherine. We actually already have a couple of questions, but first we're going to turn to Dr. John B. Gordon, District Superintendent of Suffolk Public Schools. Dr. Gordon, you all have had to be very nimble and reactive, and we'd love to hear some of the lessons that you've learned over this time as it relates to to remote learning and access for your students in Suffolk?
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. So, just like everyone else across the nation, but specifically here in Virginia, it's been a challenge. And one of the things you always try to do is you try to really set that goal of making sure that tomorrow is better than the prior day. And so when schools closed in March, the only thing I wish I really would have done differently is already have had Chromebooks and laptops in my elementary school students' hands. When I got here, we were only basically one-to-one during the day. And one of the first adjustments that we made as a part of our instructional plan was to really allow our secondary students to take those Chromebooks and those laptops home. And I wish I would have had the foresight to do it pre-K through 12, because we were really just working on instructional packets for the remainder of the spring while using some online platforms such as Edgenuity for our secondary students, because we didn't really know or really were able to plan on how we were going to close out the year. So we made that adjustment where our Chromebooks were now pre-K through 12 to start this fall, because we knew and we had more time to plan and really try to gauge where students were with any potential learning loss or learning gaps, since we were looking at 6 months for some students, even though they may have had instructional packets. And then still try to be able to tie that in to your current pacing guides and curriculum maps for what you wanted to cover for the year. But then, of course, we run into the challenge of, in Suffolk, I have 7 boroughs, and 2 of my boroughs have very poor broadband internet access. And we knew that going in. My director of technology, John Littlefield, was outstanding, where he basically had set up a map of the city showing where we had strong internet access, where we had cell phone towers, and et cetera. And our original plan was we had purchased 500 Kajit devices or MiFis to be able to give to those homes and families of those students that did not have strong broadband. And the only challenge that we ran into, that there was really only 1 cell phone tower in the area. So then, of course, that caused, some additional issues of its own. So then we signed an agreement with T-Mobile, which kind of allowed us to get 525 more of our MiFi devices. So we have about 1,025 in the school division that we began to distribute. And, it still becomes a challenge, because even in some of those areas, having 1 cell phone tower is an issue. And then as you try to expand broadband in our conversations that we've been having with the city of Suffolk, it's really only available in those areas that already have internet. And one of the biggest things that we've asked for from the city, and I'm sure several other school divisions have asked for as well, is trying to expedite the process. If it's high-speed internet, coaxial cable, increasing the number of cell phone towers, whatever, we can't basically rely on the same timeline that we did in the past, where you're looking at 3 to 6 months to get things done. I mean, that's half the school year for us. So trying to find ways to really work, very closely with your funding agent, trying to still get the impact and the feedback from your families. I basically had a lot of my families that, as we were discussing our return and learn plan, educate and innovate, really just tell me, Dr. Gordon, we want our kids back in school because we don't have internet here. I mean, regardless of what the percentage rates, the positivity rates are, we just don't have the internet. So even though we set up, exterior Wi-Fi at 3 of my school buildings, I had parent access centers at 3 of my other buildings, which will allow students and families to come in and download their information, as well as have some conversation to get instructional help. It wasn't serving everyone. And our school community was very clear in the fact that, especially after a long day's worth of work, parents were still feeling that obligation to then try to work with their kids on their instruction. But then you have that level of frustration occurring because you can't access the internet anyway. So that's been a challenge for, 2 of our 7 boroughs, and really trying to work with our city on getting that done. And so now, as for this school year, you're really taking a look at your data, really taking a hard look at your scientific data to determine, all right, if we return students to school, how many days will it be? And because of social distancing and other mitigation strategies, how many kids can you get on the bus? How many kids can you get in the classroom? What is lunch going to look like? Which bathrooms are going to be used, and then what is your disinfectant schedule for those bathrooms? I mean, all of those different thoughts have to really come together as a part of your plan. And then you also have to make sure that you explain that clearly to your school community. So, we're realists here in Suffolk, even though I'm a very, very optimistic person, I know that regardless of what decisions are made, you're not going to make everyone happy. I mean, if it's going to be based on political lines, if it's going to be based on socioeconomic status and even racial lines, you're not going to make everyone happy. but you want to be able to be transparent and open about the process and try to come up with solutions that can ideally touch, the majority of students. And that's always going to be our goal here. It's just a matter of getting everyone to really understand. This is something that I've probably said to our school community dozens of times. Education is going to look different for the rest of our lives. And we have to be able to accept that. And the way that things used to be, who knows when we're going to get back to whatever normal is. But we have to be able to adjust and kind of look at what's happening right now as ground zero. And, for some of our folks that may have some more traditionalist views, that's been tough. That's been tough to accept. But, the great guidance and work that we've had with Dr. Lane, the Virginia Department of Education, having our SOLs being waived for the year takes some pressure off, even though we still have to give the test. It does take some pressure off just for the accountability piece. But at the same time, getting everyone to know that we're basically starting over with our pedagogy. We're basically starting over with the way we're going to have education kind of continue, not only in Suffolk, but the entire Commonwealth of Virginia.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. It really helps underscore the importance of this conversation. We have Delegate Marshall. Unfortunately, I think may still be having some audio issues, but he has chatted in some questions, and then welcome other questions from folks. In particular, I think for you, Catherine, what state is doing the best job at getting broadband to the last mile and why? And also, what are some of the best state public-private funding models that could be looked at?
The first question is, sorry, it's a little hard to answer. And I think that it's hard to answer because the reason why last mile connectivity is limited really does vary at a community level. And I think we can look at a state like Tennessee that has been able to make significant progress in connecting, tens of thousands of households within the last couple of years to broadband. That's a good example. But there are circumstances within the state of Tennessee, whether we're talking about population density, whether we're talking about ease of access to the right-of-way, existing middle mile infrastructure, that ultimately influence what your measure of success is. And I'm sorry, I'm not deliberately trying to dance around the question. But I think my point is that I'm happy to send over some examples and metrics because you don't want to hear me rattle off a bunch of numbers at you right now. But what I think is important is when we're measuring success of last mile connections, why are those communities not connected in the first place is a really important question to ask. Is it a matter of population density? Is it a matter of the fact that maybe they just don't make an obvious business case for providers? Is it because getting middle mile infrastructure, close enough to those communities does it not exist? Is it cost prohibitive? I think it's a matter when we're looking at how do we do this better? How do we serve our unserved communities, the ones that are really tough to reach? There are a series of threshold questions that you have to ask and that you have to be willing to assess and address in order to get those communities online. And I think one of the things that I realized, and I didn't mean to sound insensitive when I said this earlier about Virginia being a model program, because I'm sure some of you were like, seriously, like we've got how many kids, who don't have access to broadband in their homes. And I really didn't mean to sound insensitive to the situation. I think it's really important to note the scale of this challenge and what it's going to take in terms of public investment, private investment, business partnerships, different types of models in order to meaningfully bridge the divide. So that's a very long way of saying I can send some metrics over on some of the last mile connectivity rates as well, but it's also really about the conditions and how we can measure success based on those conditions.
And are there any examples, Catherine, that you would want to highlight around public-private partnership for funding of broadband expansion?
Yeah, I think it's not just public-private partnerships, it's being open to different types of funding models. So, the interesting thing about Virginia's Middle Mile pilot program is that we are looking at a state that has been open-minded about, exploring a flexible approach for middle mile connectivity. That seems to be working. Fundamentally, when it comes down to public-private partnerships or provider-community relationships, as our friends in Minnesota like to call them, there are a couple of important components that really stood out across the country. The first is that both parties have skin in the game. That means the public sector, it means whoever the partner ends up being, whether that's the private sector, whether that is a nonprofit or cooperative, whoever it is, everybody's got to have some skin in the game. The second component of successful partnerships is the engagement of communities. What we saw in almost every program across the country is that most states are now requiring that that applicants demonstrate the demand for this service. If it is a provider who is applying for this funding, has the provider gone out into the community to assess the real need, figure out what the demand is, and are they able to demonstrate that? It's usually not a very formal process, but we call that sort of the first phase of broadband adoption, raising awareness about connections. That's really important to making sure that you can help make the business case and get your take rate, your subscription rates up high enough in order for providers to make money back on those connections. So our providers or applicants demonstrating the community demand for this. The third and most important part of these successful public-private partnerships are accountability measures. Are we all agreeing that whoever receives this public funding will agree to providing X level of service, and they will report out on some type of reporting basis with very, very different levels of formality across the country? In some states, it's just sending an email once a quarter that's a paragraph that says, hey, we've built this much out over the last quarter. We think we're on track. Here you go. In other cases, states have formal site visit processes in place. And then they also have post-grant closeout reporting requirements to make sure that networks that the states have funded are actually still operational in the several years after that funding ends. So it's really those accountability measures of making sure that those public dollars are actually doing what folks said they were being used for, what the applicants said they were going to be used for.
Thank you, Catherine. Dr. Gordon, did you want to jump in there? I think you had unmuted yourself. Okay, great. Delegate Davis, you had a question.
Sure. I want to take a different perspective. I appreciate Catherine's accolades of us doing well. I think Virginia's been an abject failure with broadband. And, we've had a long time to get prepared for the pandemic, and we're not there. And I think our priority level is shown no more by the fact that we got rid of the Secretary of Technology and then refused to put the CIO in a cabinet position. So I think that's at that stage. My concern, my question has to do with the in-school experience from a student with the pandemic, and what can we do with that? Because I know right now I've got students that today, tomorrow, after Christmas, they're still not going to be in the classroom. And I know I'm not getting broadband to all of them that don't have it today by Christmas. And I'm wondering what partners out there have other states turned to help provide an online platform experience, kind of like a Springboard. I was concerned in Virginia that that no one turned to the Virginia Virtual Academy. I mean, we have one entity that does this for their job. I mean, that's what they do for their organization, and the administration didn't turn to them. Catherine, I don't know if you've had experience, but have you seen other states where they've turned to existing entities, Khan Academy, pick something where they've been able to hit the Springboard a little harder to provide a high quality education delivery system on a platform that kind of was already there and tested and true?
Off the top of my head, no, I can't speak to that. But I think because a lot of the analysis is still ongoing, and I'm sure that Dr. Gordon can speak to this with far more detail than I can. I think to your first observation, I'm happy to answer questions about administrative structures and operational processes for how states have enshrined these efforts in government. In terms of the cost and making progress, the current estimates to get 98% of Americans access to broadband, which is the same level as water and electricity, is $80 billion. I will say that again. That is $80 billion. it will take $40 billion to get to 98%. It's going to, or excuse me, to 96%. It takes another 40 just to get to that last 2%. So, you know, I think this is why creativity in models, and also we're going to need to get skin in the game from the public and private sector. But yeah, I'm also happy to take questions as well about kind of how states have structured operational stuff with respect to CIOs and things like that. And I can get back to you on the question about Khan Academy and other online platforms, but we'll turn the mic over.
Dr. Gordon, would you like to talk a little bit about some of the platforms that you all have been leveraging?
Well, you know, a great thing from the state was the usage of Canvas as the learning management system, where you can basically house all of your instructional information in one area. And one of the things that we really had to be diligent about is making sure there was professional learning to not only educate your staff on how to use it, but also your school community to really be able to understand it, and really being able to put that virtual classroom into Canvas. And, you know, Delegate Davis brought up a good point where the main thing about the pandemic that has been the challenge is that it has really exposed every weakness that every school division has and really put it, you know, right in everyone's face. And that's been something that we all have been able to deal with, because you have the same challenges and issues, but they might actually be on different levels. So getting that professional learning to use Canvas, and then making sure that you actually had both literacy and math programs to help support actual instruction that was going on in the classroom. That was also going to be really important, because we have to be able to supplement to make sure that people can actually learn at their own pace, still having small group sessions for remediation and enrichment, but also still to be able to fill in the gaps. I mean, one of the big things that we really wanted to focus on as we started this school year in Suffolk is finding out where our kids are, and then having the conversations with the students and the families on other resources that can actually be used to support the learning. Because that we knew that we did not want to have kids online for 6 and 7 hours a day, you really wanted to make sure you had a really strong, delicate balance of synchronous learning, face-to-face time to teacher, versus asynchronous learning, where the kids are actually working on independent practice. And that was interesting, because you still had to really kind of get over the hump of getting people to understand that even if we were in a classroom, the teacher is not going to be standing in front of the students for 45 or 90 minutes straight, just lecturing and giving direct instruction. We want to really make the teacher serve more as a facilitator, really have a hard lean on student creativity, having teacher ingenuity really play a major role when it comes to really creating these active, engaged lessons. Because to us, that's the key. You have to find ways to really keep the kids actively engaged in instruction, since they're learning in a non-traditional format. And so using those learning management systems, those different instructional platforms, you know, we just had recently purchased iReady. I mean, a lot of the things that we did in Suffolk was very timely, because iReady was going to be a great way for us to be able to take a look at the diagnostic information for student literacy. That was going to partner with, of course, giving the PALS assessment and really seeing where kids are when it comes to their knowledge, and just really being able to really check their overall literacy levels. And that really needs to expand all the way throughout middle school and high school, just because of your bridge grades of 6th grade and 9th grade. I mean, you know, that learning loss piece of really taking a hard look at the grade that was in 5th grade last year, and a cohort of students that was projected to have the greatest amount of learning loss. And part of that is because of the transition of going from elementary school to middle school. So all school divisions really wanted to be proactive. And then really develop some strong relationships with your vendors, could be in trying to really make the best out of a really tough situation.
Something to that. I think the really important thing when whether we're talking about platform learning or helping any of our anchor institutions adjust to this new normal, and our, you know, our individual households as well, what are the short-term needs that we need to address, and what are the long-term needs that we need to address? And I think one of the fascinating things about this, I think it was the CEO of Microsoft maybe said this early on in the pandemic, we went from we basically had to flip a switch overnight to move to a completely digital world. You know, we're seeing massive shifts in policy to make sure that folks can actually access telehealth. We saw teachers having to figure out how to provide education to their students. And, often in cases where they didn't have the resources in their homes or the training in order to do that, parents weren't prepared. But I think the way that, in moving forward is, what are the things that we need to put in place in order to address the short-term needs? What are the things that we need in place in order to address the long-term needs? Of course, I'm thinking about that from a broadband perspective, which is, yes, hotspots are great for the time being, but maybe not the best long-term investment. But it applies in so many other policy areas as well. Not that y'all need me to tell you that, but I think that that's been one of the productive things to come out of these conversations is how are we really kind of bisecting these challenges and then, developing solutions so we can meet both the short and long-term needs.
Thank you. Other questions right now? So one other thing we've talked about in this summit so far is about the importance of early childhood education and also then the challenges we're facing right now. And thinking about for our youngest learners, what are the unique challenges? And also, I know, Dr. Gordon, that you all have been really thoughtful about how to help your educators with children with child care as well. So I would just welcome some general thoughts around early childhood and how you piece that together, understanding, and how you support your employees as well. And Dr. Gordon, I'll come to you first, and then Catherine, would love your thoughts around anything related to early childhood and the implications there as well.
Yeah, so I'll definitely tackle the early childhood piece first, because right now, in my opinion, this is probably, along with our severe special education students, our most vulnerable group of students. I mean, if you think about you're starting your first educational experience during a pandemic, especially if you may have had some deficiencies, early on, that makes things probably even more challenging for you as a learner. And so we wanted to make sure that when we did our SPS Connect initiative and we put Chromebooks in our pre-K students' hands, that we also sent YouTube videos out that gave, examples on some typing lessons, and really kind of made sure that our teachers really kind of explained to our students the importance of taking care of the machine, and then how this is going to really supplement what you're learning. But then we also had to make sure from a staff perspective that we had to be fair to that work-family balance. So, we were one of the first school divisions that really wanted to make sure that we actually brought childcare into the schools. So we put an RFP out. Alphabet was our successful winner of the RFP, where I actually have childcare in 7 of my 11 elementary schools. And we paid for the staff, because we knew that if you are trying to do your job as a virtual instructor or teach, if something's happening at home, that's going to take precedence. And so we wanted to also make sure that when teachers were coming to work, that whatever school that they chose was either close to their home or close to their location of work. And we could kind of take that burden off of you. And then we work with Alphabet, not only to make sure that they had an understanding of the pacing guides and curriculum maps that we were doing, but they also were trying to make things as actively engaged as possible. So we had STEM sessions. We also wanted to make sure we had a physical education component. I mean, different things that we could do besides taking care of the payment for our SPS staff first. And then we opened it up to the rest of the school community. And to make sure that we were still following the proper, social distancing, we could only have a maximum of 66 students in the facility. And we were basically using our, cafetoriums, as you all would probably call it, or cafenasiums, half cafeteria, half gymnasium, just so we could space the kids out, but also just to make sure that there was going to be instructional support throughout the day. We would have either a teacher or an instructional assistant would come down, a couple of times a day just to check on progress, to talk with the Alphabet staff, to try to keep the kids up to pace. And this way, hopefully to take some of the burden off the parents, again, after they come back from that hard days of work, so they don't feel like at 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, they then need to go ahead and start teaching. And to make sure that things were going to be as easy for everyone, we recorded every lesson. And we're still doing that to this day. This way you can kind of still work on things at your own pace, as well as using Fridays as our enrichment and remediation days, and looking at things over the weekend. We think recording those lessons, providing that childcare, we're hoping there were going to be different aspects that lead to success. Because one of the things when you talk to any superintendent, if it's Virginia or any other state or anywhere, there's not one set plan to solve all of this. But what you want to do is you want to have different pieces of the puzzle that all fit into the same goal. So if it's going to be childcare, if it's going to be SBS Connect with laptops and Chromebooks, enrichment remediation days, STEM activities, videos for typing tutors, videos to show parents how to use your programs, all of those work towards the same goal of making sure you're supporting the student. You have to support the staff too, because you don't want your staff to have burnout. So there's a social emotional learning, there's a mental health component for staff as well, before you get to the level that they need the employee assistance program. You want to try to be able to provide your staff with as much support as possible, including some peer lessons and some peer support too. So the early childhood students, especially early childhood special education, making sure that your IEP meetings were occurring virtually, face-to-face when necessary, and that constant communication between parents and instructional staff is probably the key to making the whole thing work.
Catherine, we're running short on time, so if you'd like to address that, and of course, and any other final remarks that you maybe would like to share as well.
I think Dr. Gordon hit just about everything as a non-learning expert that I would have hit. But I think the things that we say with all kids, but I think it's particularly true for younger learners. Think about those barriers that may stand in the way to a child getting online. So whether it is the instability of a connection, both in terms of quality, or maybe connections getting cut off to the home. It's great if there are public Wi-Fi access locations, but if those children can't get to those public Wi-Fi access locations, if they don't have means of transportation to get there, it won't work. Digital skills, digital learning is important for the students. It's also important for the parents. So it sounds like Dr. Gordon's school district has a great plan in place and has really thought about all of the contingencies. And I have to commend both the state legislators for giving the flexibility for school districts and for local leaders to respond in the best way possible, but also to educational leaders for being incredibly nimble and responding very quickly to this challenge, because I cannot imagine how hard it's been. So.
Thank you, Catherine. And certainly, as noted before, we will follow up with some more the specific details and data from Catherine, and certainly Dr. Gordon, anything you'd like to make sure we share out as well, we'll be happy to. Thank you both for joining us. Before we close this discussion out, I'm going to turn it over to Delegate Jay Leftwich. Delegate Leftwich, I know that you have experience both obviously here in the General Assembly, but as well as on the school board, and would welcome your reflections on this and what are some of the challenges and opportunities you see.
Thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me? Okay. First, thanks for having me participate in this. Hello to everyone who's signed in and logged into the summit. This is as we all know, is an extremely important topic. I've also served on the Virginia Broadband Advisory Council, and I think we've made some strides in that arena. But the one thing I would say we need to do is have that commission speak with those in the General Assembly who are in education. One of the things I found throughout my tenure in the General Assembly is that we sometimes assume the one arm is talking to the other arm, but in many situations they're not. And so that commission, I think, is gearing up to become much more active. And so as a member, I'll ask our chair to reach out to some folks on education, but I would also invite those on this call who are in education to reach out in the other direction as well. While delivery is extremely important, and I think everybody on the call recognizes that, what I worry about is the execution of what's been delivered. And I will use my own family as an example. I have an advanced degree. My wife has some college education. I have a senior in college in the house taking classes, and I have two daughters who are seniors in high school who are AP students and very successful academically. And then I have an 11-year-old who's in 5th grade. And I can tell you that despite all that support at home, 2 high school students, seniors, college bound, a college senior, and 2 parents, with some education. It's a group effort to do 5th grade science. You know, we get the assignment, you know, as day 1, day 2, all the way up to day 30. And we're like, well, what's a day? What day are we on? Constantly Googling, what's a mixture? What's a substance? You know, what's a molecule? You know, and I just can't imagine what, as Dr. Gordon talked about, what our most vulnerable students are experiencing and trying to, those families are trying to do to get their children, you know, on par with other students. And so some of my colleagues have heard me say this before, but when I was on the school board, our superintendent used to say, a bad teacher will set a child back 3 years. You can imagine what not having a teacher at all would do to a child. And I'm not saying that there are students who aren't participating in the online process that don't have a teacher. But what I'm saying is that the delivery of that, as hard as those teachers are trying, I don't believe is being executed as well as it should be. And it's nobody's fault except for the circumstances we're in. But I just don't believe that the vulnerable students are getting the support that is necessary to make sure they don't fall through the cracks. And at the risk of mentioning a hot button topic, you know, this past special session has been all about, or a lot about, systemic racism and social justice. And I just believe that we could be, unless we get our arms around this problem and dilemma, we're faced with losing perhaps a generation or a segment of a generation because they're not getting the instruction they need to succeed and compete in our society. And so, again, it's nobody's fault except that COVID has hit us, and we're faced with trying to reinvent the education model. But you know, Patrick said, what do you think some of our challenges are? And I think that's a huge, from my perspective, a huge challenge to not only get the technology delivered, but to ensure that in an online format that every single student is able to avail themselves of that technology and learn and keep pace. And that's why I use my example. If my 11-year-old, it takes, 2 high school seniors, a college student, and 2 parents to make sure that he's learning 5th grade science. Again, I can only imagine what some of our other families are struggling with in this scenario, in this situation that is now our new reality.
Thank you, Delegate Leftwich. It's a good way to wrap up that discussion. And again, thank you so much to both Dr. Gordon and Catherine for joining us for this discussion. We will be sharing out more details there. With that, I'm going to move into quickly our closing remarks from the Hunt Institute. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank a number of folks who have helped to make this event work on our end, including Laura Fornash, Jenny O'Halloran, Guy Cheatham, and Joey Cardos, who have all worked incredibly hard to make this a success. So thank you all. Obviously, I also want to thank all of the legislators who have taken time out of their very, very busy schedules that are constantly shifting to join us. And please see us as a resource. We're here to support you in a bipartisan way as much as we can. So please don't hesitate to reach out wherever we can be helpful. We will be following up with a full key takeaways document with information, links, other ideas that you all can be thinking about. So keep an eye out for that. Finally, I would also just like to make sure I acknowledge and thank our 2 co-chairs, Delegate Rosalind Tyler and Senator Luis Lucas, who have been incredible partners in making this happen, and we very much appreciate it. I should actually say one last thing before I turn it over, is that you will have an evaluation pop up at the end of this meeting when you sign off. We really appreciate you taking the time out to complete that. We use that to inform our programming and make sure it's useful and helpful for you. So please give your honest and candid feedback. With that, I will turn it over to Senator Luis Lucas. Senator, still on mute.
Unmute.
I'm so accustomed to being heard because I'm so loud. I thought you were hearing me. But I just want to thank you because time really flies when you're having fun, and this has been extremely enlightening. and we will be sure to keep our eye out for additional information from the Institute. These conversations were of great use, especially as we, the legislatures, figures out how to best serve our students and educators in the Commonwealth in a time of great difficulty. Engaging with state and national resource experts on these topics expanded our knowledge of different areas of the education continuum. And I hope that it did the same thing for everybody else that it did for me. As has been a pleasure for me to co-chair this event this year. And I want to thank every one of you for your attendance and participation in this event. Each one of you played a critical role in this convening. I especially want to thank my colleague, Delegate Tyler.
Thank you.
Who has partnered with us in this effort and co-chaired this year's policy discussion. And I want to acknowledge those who played instrumental leadership roles in the summit in the past, including my dear friend, Senator Steve Newman. And I thank you all again for taking the time to join us. And with that, I will now turn it over to my co-chair, Delegate Rosalind Tyler.
Thank you, Senator Lucas. I also want to extend my thanks to all who made the summit possible, Dr. Siddiqui and Patrick and Laura, and the previous summits that we've had. Thank you all legislators who attended and participated as we figure out our priorities in education before going back into session in January. I hope everyone found this to be a valuable learning experience that will inform us as our work go forward. And as Javed mentioned, please do keep an eye out for follow-up materials from the summit, including key takeaway documents containing careful recorded information from our conversations. Again, I want to thank everyone for making this convening possible and this summit possible, and take care and stay safe.
Thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon and stay safe, everybody.
Same to you.